Throughout the 21st century, Russia and China's economic ties have openly deepened. However, the relationship between these two superpowers is a strenuous one, and it wouldn't take much to make them mortal enemies. What would it take? And if either of these two countries did attack each other, what would prompt them to do so? And who would win? While neither country is willing to admit the reality of their relationship, the signs are there. To understand them, we need to delve into their geopolitical histories. Both countries have long traditions rich in warfare and attempts to claim superiority in their respective regions. For Russia, that's the Great Eurasian Steppe. Russia's historical ties to the steppe can be traced back to its origins as an Eastern Slavic country. However, the geography of northeastern Europe is steeped in low-lying flatland that is incredibly difficult to defend against invaders due to its sheer size and exposure. And Russia has been on the receiving end of many invasions, with perhaps the most notable being the Napoleonic Wars. Although Russia fended off the French, it showcased the relative ease with which the European part of Russia could be attacked via the Germanic lands. That's why Russia has spent considerable resources to secure its European borders and relations, which came to a head in the 20th century with the USSR. Apart from being at its peak territorially, Russia held diplomatic ties with most of Eastern Europe through the Warsaw Pact, which elevated its influence over most of the Eurasian steppe. But the situation didn't last. With the USSR dissolving and many European countries joining the US-led NATO, Russia's borders of influence were equated to its actual borders, perilously close to the country's main population centers in Europe. China's territory has ebbed and flowed over the millennia. China's current policy seems focused on claiming parts of territories it has historically owned, including but not limited to Taiwan, parts of India in the Himalayas, and swathes of the South China Sea. These territorial disputes have brought the US and several Indo-Pacific countries together to form the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, QSD or the Quad, to curb China's influence in the area. The main thorn in China's internal and external diplomacy is Taiwan, technically led by the Republic of China, which it considers a rebellious remnant of the country that needs to be brought back into the fold. However, Taiwan has the military and diplomatic backing of the US. If China decided to abandon diplomacy and invade Taiwan, it would be no doubt met by US-armed Taiwanese forces, with the rest of the Quad following close behind. This would likely create a prolonged war similar to the ongoing Russo-Ukrainian conflict. Further complicating China's foreign policy is its robust yet fragile domestic industry. As a country with the second largest population on Earth, China is woefully lacking in natural resources to support that many people working and producing for the economy. China imports most of its oil and natural gas, as well as mineral, drinking water, and timber. What makes the US particularly dangerous to China's economy is the fact that most of its oil and natural gas supplies come through shipments from the Persian Gulf. Furthermore, a vast majority of this sea traffic has to pass through the tightly controlled Strait of Malacca. To salvage the situation, China claims most of the South China Sea, almost up to the strait itself, and opposes most other countries with access to the ocean. Still, if China decided to attack Taiwan or seriously try to control its portions of the South or East China Sea, it would no doubt be opposed by the Indo-Pacific countries. As a result, the strait would likely be shut off to Chinese vessels. This would cripple the Chinese resource-demanding economy and would likely result in the country's collapse as we know it, with unfathomable consequences for world politics. With opposition from all sides, it would seem natural that Russia and China would become allies, in an attempt to curb the American influence on its borders. NATO for Russia, the Quad for China. However, this is the point where history gets complex. You see, while China and Russia are currently presenting a united front against the US, their historical ties are more hostile than you might think. Even when both countries were communist in the mid-20th century, the regimes clashed over their interpretation of Marxism-Leninism. But the most contested Chinese-Russian relations are due to two treaties in the mid-19th century. During the 19th and the first half of the 20th century, Imperial China was under heavy political, diplomatic, and military pressure from colonial and foreign imperial forces, starting with the Opium Wars and ending with the country's reinvention as the Communist People's Republic of China. The 110 years of opposition from the West has been dubbed as the Century of Humiliation by the Chinese, with many politicians repeatedly citing all the losses China suffered during that period. As part of the Century of Humiliation, China was forced to sign several so-called unequal treaties, in which China had to cede parts of its territory, control, or other diplomatic material. With Russia in particular, the two most important treaties were the 1858 Treaty of Aigun and the 1860 Treaty of Peking, which resulted in China losing the province of Outer Manchuria. While Chinese officials claim that the province isn't a point of contention, reality begs to differ. The division made by the two treaties was somewhat ambiguous, resorting to using the two main rivers in the region, Amur and Ussuri, as borders between Russia and China. However, Russia claims that all the islands in the river belong to Russia, while China claims that the border goes through the middle of the rivers, assigning the islands to a country based on its location against the middle of the river. In fact, the entire area has been hotly contested by China. Even in the 20th century, a 7-month military conflict between the Chinese and the Russians took place over the contested islands, particularly the Zhenbao or Damansky Island on the Ussuri. The 2-week battle over Zhenbao resulted in hundreds of casualties on both sides and created more than 3.5 decades of tension over the islands. Furthermore, the sedimentary island, called Bolshoi Ussuriski Island or Haixazi Island, has also been a sore spot in China's history. It stands in the confluence of the rivers, right on the border between the two countries. Claims over the island's territory have been going on since the treaties. Eventually, the two countries ratified the control of the island in a 2004 agreement that split the island between them and permitted China to use the Amur and Ussur rivers for ship traffic. However, it seems China hasn't caught up to the agreement just yet. In a map published in 2023, China displayed the entirety of the Bolshoi Ussuriski Island as being under Chinese control. While this may have been an oversight, it could also mean that China has plans regarding the previously debated region. The island itself is an undeveloped piece of land and would be an afterthought were it not for its favorable geographical position. Lying at the confluence of Amur and Ussuri, the island is perilously close to Khabarovsk, the second largest city in Outer Manchuria, which overlooks the island. Since Russia controls the portion of the island on the confluence of Amur and Ussuri, it can also control the shipping routes that are usable when the river isn't iced over. The Amur also has considerable hydroelectric and fishing capacity, something that China could greatly use due to its reliance on energy imports. Additionally, China's Ministry of Natural Resources has issued a statement relabeling cities and provinces in the Outer Manchuria region, which belongs to Russia, with Chinese names, usually historical ones from before the treaties. While it might seem that the region is relatively useless to China, you have to keep the bigger picture in mind. Outer Manchuria is one of the most populated and industrialized regions of the Russian Far East, with two cities having over 600,000 inhabitants, Khabarovsk and Vladivostok. The region is inhabited by around 4 million people, half of the entire Russian Far East population, compared to over 100 million people in the neighboring Chinese provinces. If war were to break out, China would have a massive initial manpower advantage, and the people could easily inhabit the sparsely populated Russian region after the fact. What makes Outer Manchuria a possible first front of the Sino-Russo War is also the aforementioned fact that China is a relatively resource-deprived nation. Since there are roughly 1 billion people in the country, China has a massive resource demand for energy, minerals, and even drinking water. Currently, most of the country, even though it contains some of the biggest rivers in the world, can barely produce enough to satisfy the population's need. Additionally, the biggest population center in the North China Plain has pretty much no natural drinking water supply, relying on the rest of the country and imports for its drinking water sources. As a result, China is looking for ready water supplies elsewhere, with two lucrative options: India and Russia. With pre-existing territorial disputes with India, China could potentially look into invading the water-rich Himalayan region it stakes a claim to. However, India itself houses the largest population in the world and faces a similar water scarcity problem, relying on the same region for drinking water. This makes the country much more defensive of the contested territory. Add to that the fact that India is in the Quad and also has beneficial trade relations with the West, and the US, Quad, and NATO would come down hard on China if it started an invasion on Indian soil. This leaves Russia as one of the key interest points for acquiring more resources. In terms of drinking water, Siberia is generally river-rich. However, by far the largest concentration of drinking water is in Lake Balkai, the biggest lake by volume, outstripping all Great Lakes combined, with estimates suggesting it could support the world population for decades by itself. In fact, a Chinese company aggressively purchased land around the lake in the 2010s, with plans to construct a pipeline and supply China with fresh water in 2017. The local population protested about the construction, and the Russian government intervened, forcing the Chinese company to abandon any plans to build up Lake Balkai. This doesn't mean that China will keel over. With its economy highly dependent on resources that it currently needs to import, and much of its oil and natural gas imports coming from either the Strait of Malacca or Russia itself, China might look to remove one of the middlemen from the equation. Since its south is bound in overseas territorial disputes and influenced by US foreign policies, Russia might be the next obvious choice. Without Manchuria as the entryway, China could gain access to the entire Siberian region, which is rich in oil, natural gas, minerals, timber and water. All the resources the country desperately needs to function. Furthermore, with the Russian Far East so far removed from the population and influence centers in Europe, and the Russian army currently embroiled in its own war with Ukraine, China could consider invading Russia at any moment. This way, Beijing would gain the upper hand and succeed in a quick war, the kind Putin previously failed to accomplish in Ukraine 2 years prior. Remember, most of the issues that Russia is facing right now in Ukraine are due to intervention from NATO countries. The same issues that likely won't provide Russia with any assistance against China. However, a Chinese invasion might prompt the US and the Quad to exercise their own plans to cut off China in the south, possibly creating a chain reaction of war declarations similar to that of the World Wars. Additionally, Outer Manchuria, and the Siberian region by extension, would provide China with greater access to the Pacific coastline through the Sea of Japan or the Russian Pacific coastline itself. In fact, if China were determined to bring the entirety of the Russian Far East under its own control, it could gain access to the Arctic shore itself. This is vital for an entirely different reason. You see, the main shipping routes around Eurasia and Africa currently rely on the Suez Canal and the Strait of Hormuz, followed by the Strait of Malacca, to transport goods between Western Europe and the Indo-Pacific. Alternatively to the Suez-Hormuz line would be the Cape of Good Hope, southern Horn of Africa, a route that is around 4,000 nautical miles longer. But the Arctic contains a sea and a lot of ice that's navigable for at least a part of the year during warmer months, when the ice cover is smaller. While the Arctic was previously relatively unused for maritime transport for that reason, global warming has changed the situation rapidly. A change of even a few degrees Celsius has been enough to drastically reduce the ice sheet over the Arctic Circle and open up previously inaccessible waters to ships. The Russian-controlled Northern Sea Route is currently the biggest and the shortest trading route in the region, with the other option going through the Northwest Route in Alaskan and Canadian waters. According to some studies, Arctic routes could be between 30 and 50% shorter, either in time spent at sea or distance, than those using the Suez or Panama canals, while eliminating the possible bottlenecks at the two artificial channels, a fact that became painfully obvious in the Evergreen incident in 2021. The tenuous geopolitics in Russia leave it open for influence from both the West, with which it is in a proxy war through Ukraine, and China, where it sells oil, gas, and other resources for the much-needed capital to fuel its economy and military efforts. The current situation plays well into China's hands, giving them unparalleled reach into Siberia through ongoing trade, all without actually needing to invest resources in invading the country or forcing Russia to accept the deal. With Russia stuck in a prolonged war it seemingly has no way of getting out of, it was forced to sell oil and gas to China at roughly half the rate it did to European countries. Naturally, this gives China a clear economic benefit from the Russo-Ukrainian war. As such, it works in China's favor to have Russia occupy the US and EU military efforts into Ukraine, while at the same time siphoning the resources it needs from Russia without resorting to trade through the Strait of Malacca. This has led to China famously not condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine and abstaining in any peace talks or dialogues to end the war in the region. It's quite clear that Putin's regime is working out well for China, and the country will likely remain a stern ally so long as the situation doesn't change. Furthermore, while the previous 2 years might have led everyone to believe Russia has a robust economy and is a veritable superpower in its own right, the truth is a bit more nuanced. Russia's population is roughly 1/10 of China's, and while the countries have a comparable GDP, gross domestic product, per capita, China's size gives it a clear edge. In fact, in current estimates, China is the world's second largest economy, while Russia makes it to 11th place by total GDP. The economic disparity and Russia's military, economic, and diplomatic losses that followed the invasion of Ukraine make any deals fall naturally in China's favor. So long as Russia is cut off from the rest of the world financially, it's forced to accept China's terms in order to sell its resources and power its economy. However, the melting Arctic ice might put a dent in that plan. If Russia were able to operate independent shipping year-round and impose tariffs on goods traveling through the northeast route, it could create a secondary stream of income and gain a semblance of economic independence from China. Additionally, just because Russia's current regime is favorable to China doesn't mean that the situation will stay that way. The war in Ukraine might be protracted, but it won't last forever, and Russia might reconsider its allegiance to China in the long run and cut off resource export to China from its Far East. Many experts believe that Russia doesn't have the military power to press further into Ukraine in 2024. With Ukraine steadily holding on to the support it receives from the EU and NATO, the war might be reaching a breaking point within the next few years. While there are a few possibilities on how the war will end, one of the predictions is that Russia's current regime will collapse. This will pave the way for a different leadership, with a potentially revolutionary outlook on Russia's long-term future in both Europe and Asia. The leadership might align itself more with Europe, China, or a third party altogether, and some of those scenarios might stop it from playing right into China's hands. If Russia does end up weakened enough from the Ukrainian war or start opposing its ongoing trade with China, then China wouldn't have many options left. Since the current regime under Xi is fervently opposed to the influence radiating from the US onto the Indo-Pacific, the resource-starved Chinese will need to obtain more goods from its north, i.e. Russia. This circles back to the seemingly solved dispute between Russia and China on the matter of which country controls parts of Outer Manchuria. While China has gained back most of the territories it lost during the century of humiliation, the provinces of Outer Manchuria are still under Russian control. Given that China is still pressing claims on areas it had long lost any legal ties on and are loosely historically connected to China, such as the claims in the South China Sea, it's highly likely to reverse course on its previous agreements with Russia and claim back the lost provinces in Manchuria. Considering the present economic and demographic inequality between the regions separated by the Amur and Ussuri, China's invasion would likely be swift and deadly. In all likelihood, it would displace or culturally assimilate the Russians in the area before reinforcements from the European parts of Russia could arrive. Since the area is already starting to be influenced by China due to ongoing trade, it's also possible that China might imitate the Russian annexation of Crimea to gain access to the Japanese Sea. Alternatively, it might begin its advance into the rest of the Russian Far East. In essence, what is currently happening in Ukraine could be repeated. In the way Russia wants to diversify its port access and limit the influence of other countries on its economy, China could do the same thing in the future to Russia. With Russia weakened from the war, it's unlikely to remain the world's 11th economy for long and will likely be shattered by conflicting ideologies from within. That would leave Russia underpopulated, underrepresented, and underdeveloped. Yet the resource-rich and highly lucrative Far East will be ripe for the taking by the country that stands to gain the most from utilizing those resources: China. The only question that remains is how China will actually attack Russia. While China's current policy is non-interference, the country could reverse that course and try to sponsor a deal between Russia and Ukraine. During peace accords, China may impose its own influence on both Russia and Ukraine, forcing either country to accept whatever terms China deems best for its own agenda. In exchange, China would fund reconstruction and reinvigoration efforts in the war-struck areas of Ukraine. On the surface, the EU would likely welcome this deal, as Ukraine's reconstruction efforts are most likely going to be funded by the EU. Talks about the country joining the EU in an expedited process have been underway for some time. This would also suit China's plans to undercut the US influence around the world. If the EU doesn't have to support yet another country and can rely on Chinese-brought infrastructure in Ukraine, the US doesn't have as much leverage. While the EU is currently importing Norwegian and American oil and gas, the end of the Russo-Ukrainian war could drastically change the trading routes on a global scale. With Russia free to resume exporting oil and gas to Europe, the US will lose one of its biggest export partners. It's currently unknown whether Russia can actually satisfy the needs of both China and the EU, but China could support the trade if it retains its influence on Russian politics and economy. Even if China doesn't create a lucrative offer to end the Russo-Ukrainian war, it could end the war forcefully by pulling the plug on economically supporting Russia. While Russia would likely retaliate by cutting off the resources from Siberia, China could open up claims to Outer Manchuria as a proxy. By invading Russia, it can take hold of the resources itself and cut out the middleman from the equation. Before long, China could feasibly gain access to the Sea of Japan, or even freezing Siberian ports in the Arctic, allowing it to bypass the Strait of Malacca and place its products directly into Western Europe. In the end, while Russia and China's current stance is that the countries have an alliance, in actuality, Russia is only a few steps away from becoming China's vassal or being attacked by China's numerically superior forces while being completely unprotected from Europe. Then it's up to China to decide what claims it would pursue, and to the US and the rest of the Quad to determine how to proceed in creating a new world order. It should be mentioned that all of these scenarios are only rough approximations or conjectures. Each one is based on the current events in Russia, Ukraine, and the geopolitics surrounding the China-US rivalry in the Indo-Pacific. If something drastically changes in the foreign policies of either of the parties, China could be facing a much worse war against the entirety of the US and the Quad before it strikes against Russia. But what do you think? Is China going to attack Russia, or is it still too afraid of American countermeasures? In the event China does attack, will it press far into Siberia or settle by regaining the region of Outer Manchuria? Let us know in the comments section below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more military content from military experts.
The Chinese military is one of the largest militaries on planet Earth, spending an incredible $293 billion in 2021 on defense. They rank second in the world, behind the United States. Coming in second here is impressive enough. If you know anything about Uncle Sam, then you know they won't be outspent when it comes to the military. The Chinese military is officially known as the People's Liberation Army, or PLA, and it consists of 5 service branches: the Ground Force or Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Rocket Force, which handles all kinds of ballistic, nuclear, and other missiles, and the Strategic Support Force, which deals with space, cyber, electronic, and political warfare. Highly trained, motivated, and armed with an arsenal of deadly weapons, they are truly a formidable fighting force. However, as the world saw with the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, having a massive army and all the shiny weapons you can ask for doesn't guarantee success. So how does the PLA stack up against the rest of the world? What does history tell us about their level of preparedness? And how would they fare if a real war were to break out? Before we delve deeper into the current capabilities and strategies of the PLA, it's essential to take a step back in time. How did the PLA evolve into the formidable force we see today, and what historical events shaped its development? The journey begins with the PLA's inception on August 1, 1927, during the Nanchang Uprising, a landmark moment that ignited the Chinese Civil War. It was in the crucible of this war and the subsequent conflicts that followed where the PLA honed its skills and strategies. Throughout the 1930s, the Communist PLA and the nationalist forces led by Chiang Kai-shek clashed across China in a brutal struggle, a conflict that resulted in millions of casualties. Understanding this tumultuous history is key to comprehending the PLA's current form and function. One of the most pivotal events was known as the Long March, when the communist forces primarily commanded by Mao Zedong found themselves in a difficult position, facing certain encirclement and defeat. Mao took his forces on a 5,600-mile march across China to another communist stronghold. A fraction of his forces survived the march, but it cemented Mao as a living legend among the Chinese. His leadership and bravery gave the PLA the motivation they needed to stay in the fight. In 1937, however, hostilities were mostly put on hold when Imperial Japan invaded China. The two sides officially formed the Second United Front and decided to deal with the most apparent threat, the Japanese, before resuming the fraternal bloodshed. During World War II, the PLA played a pivotal role in the Allied resistance against Japan. They had very few technological advantages, very few armored units, poor weaponry, and no real training, but they persisted nonetheless. Chinese resistance would continually infuriate and demoralize the Japanese invaders. They employed a wide range of guerrilla tactics and were an extremely useful ally of the United States and British forces. Once World War II ended in 1945, the PLA and Kuomintang went right back to killing each other. The second phase of the Chinese Civil War ran from 1945 until 1949, and again resulted in millions of casualties and untold levels of destruction. The PLA proved they had what it took to win, however, as they won the hearts and minds of the Chinese people and proved far more capable and competent at governing than their nationalist brethren. Finally, in 1949, Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists suffered defeat after defeat, lost control over the country, and retreated to Taiwan. Even though they did not admit defeat, the war was over. Mao, the Communist Party, and the PLA had won, and their victory was the cornerstone in establishing the People's Republic of China. The celebrations were short-lived, however, as China joined the Cold War on the side of the Soviet Union. The skyrocketing tensions eventually erupted into incredible levels of violence again, this time against the United States and its allies. China joined the rapidly escalating Korean War on October 19, 1950, when the PLA crossed the Yalu River to support their North Korean allies. It was this force that was temporarily renamed the People's Volunteer Army, the logic being that using the word volunteer was implying a less aggressive stance on behalf of the Chinese government, meaning that the troops were there as volunteers out of a sense of duty to their Korean comrades. Not sure the rebranding made a difference to the men on the ground, whichever side they fought for. Once the Chinese forces crossed the Yalu, they swept through North Korea, pushing back UN and US forces until it came to a head at a place called Chosin Reservoir. This battle is infamous for its ferocity, horrendous weather conditions, as well as the overall resilience and bravery of the men who fought there. With temperatures dropping to as low as -38 Fahrenheit, frostbite was rampant and many men were pushed to their breaking point. The Chinese forces here had a variety of weapons and equipment. Some were left over from the Japanese and Kuomintang troops, while others were scavenged from fallen Americans or provided by their Soviet allies. This lack of continuity presented an interesting logistical challenge for their supply lines, but the PLA persisted nonetheless. Most of their weapons were small arms such as rifles, submachine guns, light machine guns, grenades, and mortars. The PLA did not have much in the way of heavy weapons such as artillery or air support, and what they did have usually came from the Soviets. The greatest resource the PLA had at this point was its manpower. During the battle, they employed rapid flanking and infiltration tactics aimed at maximizing their numerical advantage, similar to what the Soviets did during World War II. The thinking was that if you threw enough men at a numerically inferior position, eventually they would overwhelm it, or the Americans would run out of ammunition and be surrounded. Accounts from the battle describe seeing wave after wave of Chinese troops attacking US and UN positions with grim determination to fight for every foot of ground. These tactics saw success, but were always accompanied by staggering casualty rates. Battling against the enemy as well as the elements, the Chinese troops and their North Korean allies eventually captured a large part of the battlefield. However, they paid for it with a tremendous amount of blood, with the true winner of the battle still being debated today. Chosin had proven to the PLA, as well as the world, that the Chinese military was not a backwater force of ill-equipped peasants. While they may not have had the best equipment, they used what they had to deadly effect. One thing was clear: the PLA was becoming a modern military force capable of taking on the UN and the United States. The Chinese-Soviet relationship meant that the PLA would continue to receive weapons, training, and guidance from their Russian counterparts as the Cold War escalated. After the Korean War, the PLA continued its march toward modernization through a series of smaller conflicts and proxy wars. With the death of the Communist Party leader Mao Zedong in 1976, China began even more campaigns to modernize the PLA and level the playing field with the rest of the world. From 1975 to today, the PLA has undergone a tremendous change and has become one of the world's most formidable militaries, at least on paper. The two most recent examples of the PLA's combat experience illustrate how far they have come and how far they have to go. Since 1975, these two examples are the only times the PLA has seen legitimate combat, and what happened in each speaks volumes about where the PLA stands today. In 1979, China and Vietnam fought a war now known as the Sino-Vietnamese War. This dispute between neighbors started as a response to Vietnam's invasion and occupation of their neighbor Cambodia. Vietnam set out to put an end to the particularly murderous and Chinese-backed Khmer Rouge regime. The Khmer Rouge had been in power since their victory over the Cambodian government in 1975. From 1975 to 1979, the Khmer Rouge conducted widespread genocide on the Cambodian people. When the dust settled, between 1.5 to 3 million people had been murdered, which at this time was a quarter of the Cambodian population. Vietnam did not like what was going on across their western border and liked it even less when the Khmer Rouge soldiers attacked across the Vietnamese border repeatedly. This back and forth went on for a few years, but it exploded on Christmas Day, December 25, 1978, when Vietnam decided to invade Cambodia. Vietnamese forces overthrew the Khmer Rouge government in just 2 weeks and installed their own puppet government. Seeing as the Khmer Rouge had been backed by the Chinese government was very angry and vowed to retaliate. This retaliation started on February 17, 1979, and lasted for about a month. PLA forces overran the northern Vietnamese border and gained large amounts of territory quickly. The northern part of Vietnam saw heavy fighting and tremendous casualties on both sides. Most of the fighting took place in the provinces of Cao Bang, Lao Cai, and Lang Son. The Vietnamese tried to avoid direct confrontations, instead opting for what had been their bread and butter for decades, guerrilla warfare. The PLA force that they faced had not seen real combat since the early 1950s, and was a little rusty. The weapons and vehicles they used were outdated or not up to the task. Their soldiers were mostly untested and green. The Vietnamese, on the other hand, had been fighting continually since World War II and had mostly modern weapons. The fighting raged until March 16, 1979, with both sides claiming victory. China claimed it had won a victory and had opened the road to Hanoi, basically saying that they could have taken the capital, but they just didn't want to. The Vietnamese forces remained as an occupying force in Cambodia and claimed that they had won by repelling the PLA forces and forcing them to withdraw. With thousands upon thousands dead and nothing really gained by either side, things returned to normal and nothing had really changed. For the PLA, although not much had been gained, they realized quickly that to be a competitive military in a fast-paced world, they needed to up their game and continually improve. This served as a wake-up call and ego check. From the end of the Sino-Vietnamese War in 1979 all the way until 2016, the PLA had a few engagements, but nothing of substance. The next time they saw significant combat came in 2016, when they were part of a UN peacekeeping mission in South Sudan. This conflict was the first test of the PLA's combat capabilities for the first time in 4 decades, and served as an indication of the combat readiness and effectiveness of the PLA. China committed combat troops to the UN for the first time in 2015, a major divergence from their long-held stance of no foreign intervention. Since 2000, China had steadily increased their military aid to the UN, and in early 2015 sent 700 combat soldiers to South Sudan. The Chinese government did not undertake this mission simply out of the goodness of their heart, however, as the Chinese government has significant financial interests in Sudanese petroleum. Say what you will, but I challenge you to find any government that does things solely to help people and not for some ulterior motive. Glass houses, folks, glass houses. In 2016, the peacekeeping soldiers of the PLA were responsible for the security of a large section of the South Sudanese capital of Juba. Due to decades of rampant violence, there were over 37,000 displaced civilians in and around the capital. The Chinese soldiers here were tasked with protecting these civilians in official UN camps. The camps themselves had very little in terms of protection against an assault by combat-hardened troops backed by artillery and tanks. These camps were more refugee camps than they were military redoubts, and that mistake would be costly. Protected mainly by barbed wire fences, sand-filled HESCO boxes, wooden guard towers, and chain-link fences, the Chinese UN troops were not in a good situation. To make matters worse, 2 different and warring armies were converging on Juba. One army had the current president at the helm, and the other army was commanded by the former vice president. In terms of strength estimates, no one is sure of the number of government troops present, but the generally accepted number of rebel troops was around 1,400. On July 8th, both armies attacked the city and the UN-run camps. To no one's surprise, the 2 armies observed no rules of engagement and attacked everyone they came across. A widespread campaign of looting and violence commenced, with the civilians stuck in the crossfire, looking to the UN soldiers to do the exact thing that they were there to do and what they are named for: keep the peace. The Chinese peacekeepers were completely outgunned, outnumbered, and overwhelmed. They fought as best as they could, but only really had light squad-level weapons and a handful of armored troop carriers. As a result, the Chinese troops were forced to retreat further into the camps and set up a last stand. The civilians caught up in this madness were brutally killed, tortured, and forced to endure other unspeakable horrors. In addition to this, a UN aid warehouse was raided and emptied of its food and medical supplies. This aid was being directly used to help the refugees of war and was estimated to be worth a total of $30 million and enough food to help 200,000 people for over a month. The Chinese soldiers did the best they could, fighting back against a superior force. They did successfully deter assaults into the heart of the camps and help defend the 9,000 civilians sheltering there. After 3 days of fighting, countless civilians, militiamen, and 2 Chinese soldiers were dead. The Chinese soldiers died when a rocket-propelled grenade, or RPG, hit an armored troop carrier near them. The troop carrier's armor is designed more for deflecting landmines than stopping high-explosive rockets. In the immediate aftermath, all anyone cared about was who to point the finger at for this catastrophic failure of the UN's mission. The UN released several scathing reports claiming that the Chinese soldiers had failed to follow orders, abandoned their posts, and ultimately contributed to the failure. One analyst even went as far as to claim that Chinese soldiers are risk-averse and aren't willing to take the aggressive action necessary to win the fight. The Chinese government obviously refuted these claims, stating that the UN rules of engagement and subsequent policies regarding combat severely limited the soldiers in what they could actually achieve and the equipment they could use. They claimed that the UN kept the soldiers in a defensive posture that put them at a disadvantage. What they are saying is that the Chinese peacekeepers were not put into a position to be successful. There was also a high level of confusion here, as there was no centralized command. Chinese troops received sometimes conflicting orders from multiple officers, often from different nations. As with most arguments, the truth is somewhere in the middle. Before this, the PLA had not seen real combat since 1979, which means that any officers with combat experience would be well into their 60s. Not ideal. Training is great but can only go so far. No one knows how they will react when live rounds are flying too close for comfort, so it should not surprise anyone that the Chinese troops here tried their best but simply did not have enough field experience to make a difference. It also didn't help that they were outnumbered and outgunned. If they had their own equipment and vehicles, would it have changed the outcome? We can only speculate. Either way, it was an unmitigated disaster. What happened here was like if the Yankees played a single A team and got blown out by 10 runs. So while this battle makes the PLA's lack of real combat experience at every level glaringly apparent, it's also a critical failure on the part of the UN to adequately arm and prepare these men for the reality of the situation. Where does the PLA stand today? As of the production of this video, the PLA has about 2 million active duty troops with another 500,000 in reserve. Of those 2 million active duty troops, around 700,000 of them are conscripts, which isn't ideal for morale. Those conscripts go out to serve on 2-year enlistments. As discussed earlier, these troops are spread out across the 5 branches of the service, as well as with various auxiliary and police units. The PLA has a variety of weapons at its disposal. The main infantry rifles issued to its troops are the QBZ-95 and QBZ-191, which fire a 5.8 x 42mm round. In terms of sidearms, they utilize the OSZ-92, which fires a 5.8 x 21mm DAP-92. For a bit of a bigger bang, they have the PF-89 unguided anti-tank rocket launcher. For heavy weapons, the PLA boasts a large contingent of armor that theoretically rivals its Western counterparts. The ZTZ-99A main battle tank and ZBD-04A infantry fighting vehicle are great examples of this. While they have not seen combat directly, they have all the tools necessary to be deadly. The Navy of the PLA is considered one of the most, if not the most powerful Navy in the world, with a battle force of 350 ships. For comparison, the US Navy has around 290 ships in its battle force. In terms of firepower, PLA Navy is extremely formidable as well, even outpacing the US Navy as per a 2016 study. The PLA Air Force is impressive as well, with 400,000 service members and 3,500 aircraft. They boast an arsenal of modern aircraft including the formidable Chengdu J-20. In terms of combat experience, not much has changed since the debacle of 2016. The only PLA officers or enlisted men with actual combat experience would be the ones who are still alive following the Sino-Vietnamese War, or one of the few who were involved in the Battle of Juba in 2016. Either way, not a lot of tried and true combat wisdom can be passed down to the lower ranks, and that's not what you want when you're gearing up for war. The best the PLA can do is train as realistically as possible. So that being said, what kind of training do they receive? All members of the PLA, when they initially enlist, are taken through basic training, similar to almost all other militaries on the planet. After that, they continue to more specialized training. In recent years, the Chinese government and high-ranking PLA officers have acknowledged that the lower ranks, and especially the conscripts, have not been receiving enough adequate training to prepare them for the task ahead. To fix this, they have stagnated conscription cycles so that they can afford to give units more substantial training and get them as prepared as possible for their new roles. As they say, practice makes perfect, and the PLA takes that one to heart. They drill relentlessly every summer, doing large-scale mock combat operations and try to get as close to the real thing as they possibly can. This includes the use of virtual reality systems, which allow the soldiers, sailors, and airmen to train in realistic scenarios without risk of injury. In 2023, the PLA focused on enhancing its integrated combat and rapid response capabilities. This means that they are working on efficient communication and coordination between the different branches of the PLA as they respond to a variety of external threats. Looking toward the future, China will continue to train relentlessly as global tension continues to mount. In regard to its hostile relationship with its neighbor Taiwan, the PLA continues to conduct military exercises and training in preparation for the likely amphibious invasion. It's no secret that China wants Taiwan brought back into the fold, but how they plan to actually achieve that is anyone's guess. While the fallout from this invasion would be an international catastrophe, the results of such a move is not clear. Taiwan is preparing as well and has turned the island into a fortress with hidden aircraft hangars, surface-to-air missiles, and enough machine gun nests to make anyone think twice. The Chinese government and subsequently the PLA have an increasing interest in the resources of Africa. As the market for the resources and the energy produced here become more valuable, it will be more important than ever for Chinese interests to be protected. It's really a question of when more PLA troops will be stationed there, not if. So all in all, the People's Liberation Army looks great on paper. It has everything you can want in a modern military: thorough training, advanced weapons, impressive armor, and ships. The one thing it lacks, that's so crucial to success, is combat experience. None of their enlisted men, except for some who might have been at Juba, have any experience getting shot at. For the officers, the only ones with tangible experience are well past fighting age or unlucky enough to have participated in Juba alongside their men. All the best weapons in the world aren't going to mean a thing if the soldiers using them don't have the experience to use them effectively while under fire. While the PLA could be an incredible fighting force when things heat up, all we can do now is speculate. Until the bullets start flying, there's no telling how they'll perform. So while the world holds its breath watching what will happen between China and Taiwan, the actual combat effectiveness of the PLA is going to be a topic of debate. As always, if you enjoyed today's video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let us know what you thought in the comments as well. Now go and check out why China's military is a paper tiger, or click this other video instead. Hour 0. Sitting in his office surrounded by his most trusted advisors, Xi Jinping feels ready. Over the past decade or more, he's spent billions upon billions modernizing China's military. His nation now has nuclear weapons, around 500 of them, and he's built one of the world's largest navies. Add to that the fact that China's military has more active members than any other nation, with 2.35 million people to call on. He's going to bring war to the United States. But to do so, he has to carefully coordinate attacks throughout the Pacific. He knows that the United States has bases in Japan and South Korea, around 190 in those two countries alone, and a powerful navy that, though smaller than his, packs a lot more firepower. A full frontal assault on the United States without taking care of those problems first would be suicide. He needs to secure the Pacific, giving China a route toward the American mainland as a priority. His attack doesn't begin with missile launches. It starts on the cyber front. For years, China has been working on cyber technology that would allow it to hack into American infrastructure and military defense systems, limiting America's response to an attack in the process. On occasion, China gets caught out. In December 2023, for instance, the United States conducted an operation to disrupt a network of small office, home office, or SOHO routers that China had taken control of, using the KV botnet to mask its hacking activities. That was unfortunate for Xi, but it won't stop the first stage of his attack. Xi gives the okay and dozens of cyber attacks begin. Chinese hackers work feverishly, targeting American water systems, electrical grids, and communication systems, with a special focus on any that are located near key military installations. Further attacks take place within the networks of companies that provide critical services to America's military, as well as attacks on systems and transportation methods that will be used by the United States to deliver aid to Taiwan in the case of a Chinese invasion. That last step is critical. To reach the United States, China has to secure a passage through the Pacific. Taiwan, which China has claimed for decades should be part of the People's Republic anyway, is chosen as the main target. By securing that island, China can break through the nations in the Pacific that are allied to the United States, including Japan and South Korea, and clear its route to the American mainland. Hour 1. The United States is scrambling. It's no stranger to Chinese hackers, but it's never faced an operation of this scale before. The country's success against Volt Typhoon, the elite group of Chinese hackers that were responsible for the KV botnet attacks mentioned earlier, revealed that China has its fingers in major networks. Rail, mass transit, maritime, water, and pipeline systems were all under threat. And though Volt Tycoon has been mostly eradicated, the sheer scale of the disruption occurring in the US reveals that it was far from the only hacker group China had in play. America is left chasing shadows, at least for a couple of hours, which is all China needs to start the next stage of its assault. Xi Jinping gives the okay for the next and boldest part of its strategy: activating the People's Liberation Army Rocket Force, or PLARF. The group has around 120,000 members, who combine to operate 6 known ballistic missile bases throughout China. However, the PLARF's real strength lies in the sheer number of missiles it has at its disposal. Recent estimates from the US Naval Institute place the number at somewhere around 4,000, all of which are capable of targeting ships moving at sea in addition to static land-based targets. Both capabilities will be needed by Xi. In arranging this attack, he's had to make some difficult decisions. He knew that a launch against Taiwan was inevitable, and the island nation became his first target. A missile barrage begins, with air support being provided by the recently upgraded bases at Longqian, Jiangsu, and Wuhan. All three are supporting China with fleets of Shenyang J-16 fighters, launching missiles of their own while engaging Taiwanese defenses in the air. The tougher attacks focus on the US Pacific Fleet. Numbering around 200 ships, along with 1,500 aircraft and 150,000 military personnel, that fleet is the biggest barrier that stands in the way of Xi's ambitions to invade the United States. It covers almost half of the world's surface, stretching from Antarctica to the Arctic Circle, taking in the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean in the process. Xi can't hit everything in that fleet, but his goal is to strategically weaken the fleet in the early hours of his new war, eliminating America's ability to rapidly respond to his actions. To do that, he needs a 3-pronged missile attack. First, he has to engage the naval bases the United States has set up in Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines. It's a risky move. Any missile strike on these nations will surely cause collateral damage, potentially bringing all 3 of them into the war in support of the US. But failure to strike now means leaving nearly 200 bases ready to launch an immediate counterattack supported by around 79,000 troops. Xi can't take that risk. Hordes of Dongfeng 26 or DF-26 missiles are launched towards America's bases in Japan and South Korea. Each missile has a range of 2,485 miles, easily ensuring they can reach their targets. They're accompanied by shorter-range missiles, such as the DF-16, for a simple reason. Xi needs his DF-26s for attacks further afield. Those very missiles are also part of the second part of China's missile barrage, attacking closer to the United States. More are sent flying toward Guam, targeting the Andersen Air Force Base in Yago, as well as Naval Base Guam in Santa Rita. Xi also unleashes the new jewel in China's missile crown to strike Hawaii. The DF-27 is a hypersonic missile that can just about reach America's east coast and is capable of evading US missile defenses. It'll be Xi's chief weapon when attacking the American mainland, at least during the early stages of the war. Finally, the third strike, attacking American ships that are currently in the Pacific. Chief among the targets will be the small fleet of cruisers America has in the water near China, including the USS Shiloh and USS Mobile Bay. All told, there are 9 of these ships, all packed with heavy armaments and strong anti-air defenses that China hopes to either eliminate or damage heavily. Secondary targets include the much larger fleet of US Navy destroyers, which pack less of a punch than the country's cruisers but will still be enough to cause serious damage to the Chinese fleet if they're allowed to go unchecked. There are dozens to target, and Xi knows that he won't be able to take out all of them. But the more he can destroy with missiles now, the easier he'll find his invasion of Taiwan and subsequent passage to America. However, Xi's missiles won't have clear paths to their target. Though his cyber attacks have left the United States scrambling, it hasn't shut down the country's missile defense systems. America's DSP satellites, overseen by its Space Force, easily detect China's missile launches, giving President Joe Biden time to organize the country's defenses. Chief among these will be its ground-based interceptors, or GBIs, of which there are currently 44 active in the United States. Most of these systems, 40, are stationed in Alaska, though they're still capable of destroying intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, traveling at around 15,000 miles per hour. The other 4 are stationed in California, much closer to China's Hawaiian targets, and will be responsible for providing most of America's defenses against China's missile barrage. There's just one problem. What if any of the missiles contain nuclear warheads? Biden consults his advisors, who conclude that possibility is unlikely. American satellites show that the missiles are on course to hit its Pacific bases and Hawaii, suggesting a conventional strike. If Xi were going nuclear, his ICBMs would be on their way to Washington and other key strategic locations in the American mainland. Right now, the strategy is clear: evacuate troops from the anticipated strike zones and hunker down. A counterattack will come, but at present, the US has to rely on its missile defense systems. Across the Pacific, Xi watches and waits as the first of his missile barrages travel toward their targets in Japan and South Korea. Both have activated their missile defense systems to guard America's bases, with the platform they rolled out alongside the US toward the end of 2023, giving them advance notice of the missiles China has launched. Many get shot out of the sky, falling harmlessly into the Pacific, but the sheer number of Chinese missiles overwhelms the defenses. Okinawa is practically destroyed. As home to most of America's overseas military in Japan, it was the chief target of these strikes. At the Kadena Air Base, missiles rained down on F-15 Eagle fighters, E-3 Sentry planes, and KC-135 Stratotankers. The latter are especially important targets. They'll limit America's ability to refuel its aircraft in the air, restricting them to using the bases that China is so steadfastly attacking. The strike could be considered a success, killing thousands of American troops in the process. But Xi knows the bases aren't fully out of commission. He can't launch a ground-based invasion just yet, meaning the surviving crews at these bases will be able to rebuild quickly enough to continue to serve as launching points for the US Air Force. That's okay, he only needs them down for a few days. More missiles make their way toward cruisers and destroyers that the US has stationed in the Pacific. These ships are a little harder to strike, not least because they're not remaining still. Orders from American command have told all to start moving in erratic patterns, hoping to send Chinese missiles off course in the process. The tactic works in some cases, though not in others. China is successful in cutting down about half of America's cruisers, as well as several dozen destroyers. Again, a qualified success for Xi. A few minutes later, China's DF-27 and DF-26 missiles are drawing nearer to Hawaii. Dozens are shot out of the sky by California's missile defense systems, but they can't provide complete coverage. Many more break through, striking ships including the USS Frank E. Peterson and USS Hopper. Xi had hoped his strike would also take out at least some of the 13 submarines stationed in Hawaii, but no such luck. Even with his cyber attacks wreaking havoc, the commanders and crews of those submarines received orders to submerge underwater, safe from the missile barrage, until the US was ready to fight back. By the end of the first few hours of the conflict, China has expended nearly a quarter of its 4,000 missiles. It has wreaked devastation on the American bases in Asia, though at the cost of drawing Japan and South Korea into Xi's war. America's Pacific Fleet has been severely weakened, with Xi's cyber attacks also limiting the speed in which the US can respond to what he's going to do next. The strike's success wasn't total, but it was enough. Day 2. Having bought himself some time with his attack on the United States, leaving his main enemy in a temporary state of disarray, Xi can focus on his immediate target, Taiwan. China has spent the last day battering Taiwan with short-range missiles. The barrage has been successful in taking out several targets, including the smaller islands surrounding Taiwan, but it's also faced a steadfast defense from the US-made Patriot air defense system stationed on the island, as well as Taiwan's own Skybow surface-to-air ballistic missile defense systems. Still, the barrage will have to end soon, if only because Xi wants to send ground troops in to take the island. He can't risk killing his own people in friendly fire situations. After a 24-hour bombardment in which China expends hundreds of missiles, Xi assesses the damage he's caused. Crucially, his attacks on America's overseas bases, as well as America itself, will delay its navy in reaching the Taiwan Strait, and the missiles he's fired at Taiwan have severely weakened its naval defenses, while fighter planes from Longqian, Jiangsu, and Huan keep the country's air force occupied. He feels ready to start landing troops on the Taiwanese mainland, but therein he finds a problem. His landing options are limited. That's partially due to the actions of Taiwan's president, Tsai Ing-wen. She's been preparing for an attack from China for several months, especially in the wake of Beijing growing bolder by conducting military and naval operations in the Taiwan Strait. As soon as the missiles started flying, Tsai sent orders to defensive positions on both sides of the island. To the east, Taiwan benefits from having an extensive network of cliffs. Tsai anticipates that Xi will look to blockade that side of the island with his navy, but is unlikely to launch a full invasion from the east. Still, soldiers are placed on alert, telling them to prepare to fight against ground troops that might try to climb the cliffs, which have gradients of at least 15%. If need be, those troops will receive orders to destroy the routes built through the cliffs that lead to the mainland. Her main focus lies in Taiwan's west. As the coast closest to China, it's going to be the point of ingress into the island. Tsai places all 15 major ports and harbors on that coast on high alert, with orders for their destruction in place if China's forces get near. Tsai can't afford to allow China to set up a naval presence on the island itself if it manages to invade. Then there are Taiwan's beaches. All are heavily fortified, with any Chinese troops that manage to land having to make their way through scores of barbed wire-laden defenses just to achieve any hope of reaching the roads that lead to Taipei. The waters leading to most of those beaches are less than 50 feet deep, meaning China can't land troops en masse. It must take them most of the way before ferrying them across in smaller vessels, all while being subjected to missile fire from Taiwan. Those waters are also packed with shallow mines, with the beaches also containing anti-landing spikes that will prevent China's tanks from making inroads. And if worst comes to worst, Tsai can collapse the roads leading into Taipei from the west, forcing Chinese troops to navigate challenging terrain if they ever hope to reach Taiwan's capital. Tsai is going to make this a war of attrition, and that spells bad news for Xi. Day 3. The United States is almost ready to counter the initial Chinese offensive. But before it does, Biden puts on his diplomatic hat as he prepares to exploit a key weakness in Xi's plan. One of China's biggest challenges in the war is economic. The country relies heavily on importing goods, spending $2.56 trillion in 2023 alone. Biden has spent the last 3 days organizing heavy sanctions against China, with America's network of allies finally paying off. China will not only struggle to import goods and equipment from the United States, but it'll also be cut off from its European trade partners. All agree to not sell to or buy from China, essentially creating a blockade for as long as the war lasts. That blockade extends to oil. China imports 11.8 million barrels of oil per day to keep itself running. Much of that oil comes from Russia, which is now responsible for about 19% of the oil China buys annually. However, the other 81% comes from countries like Saudi Arabia, which are allied to the United States. Leveraging diplomatic pressure, as well as the concerns that other Asian nations such as Saudi Arabia have related to Chinese expansion, Biden is able to cut off most of the oil reaching China. Yes, Russia will supply Xi, though it isn't able to cover the massive shortfall that results from America's sanctions. And given Putin's war in Ukraine, he also can't risk Russia's trade with other countries for the sake of solely supporting China, especially given that he faces his own sanctions. Xi didn't expect this. Now he faces a shutdown. China has to defeat the United States in a matter of months, or else its resources will dwindle to the point where it's practically starved out of the fight that it started. Day 4. With sanctions in place and trade routes in the process of being cut off, Biden's next move is to speak to his allies in NATO. After all, China directly attacked America on its own soil by launching missiles at Hawaii. It also attacked America-owned military bases overseas, which would also constitute an attack on the US. All of this plays in Biden's favor for one reason: Article 5 of the NATO Charter. According to this article, if any NATO ally or member nation is the victim of an armed attack by another country, every other NATO member will consider this an act of violence against themselves. In short, China's attack on the United States has brought most of Europe into the fold. Biden has been cooperating with NATO members from the moment he detected China's missiles. Collectively, that makes him ready to utilize the power of 31 nations, including what's left of the United States defenses. The focal point of the counterattack is obvious: the Taiwan Strait. Xi has failed to take Taiwan with his missile barrage and now faces an extended conflict in which he's losing thousands of troops every day to his attempts to land on Taiwanese beaches. Even if he manages to break through Taiwan's defenses by simply throwing sheer numbers at the island, his troops will face an urban warfare campaign that will see them fight tooth and nail for every street they manage to claim. Xi didn't expect this. And this war of attrition all adds up to time that the US and its allies can take to prepare an attack. The strategy is to combine America's naval resources with those of its NATO allies, as well as the navies of South Korea, Japan, and Australia. The latter will also be a focal point of the counterattack, as China neglected to destroy the bases America has set up in Australia. The United States sends a fleet of ships, including most of its stock of 11 aircraft carriers, toward the Taiwan Strait. They're accompanied by one of the UK's aircraft carriers, the HMS Queen Elizabeth, loaded with Typhoon FGR-4 and F-35B Lightning jets. Similar support comes from Canada, which commits half of its 12 frigates to the American cause, as well as Japan, which sends most of its fleet of 36 destroyers. South Korea hesitates. It's happy to support the US in any way that it can, but it also has to be wary of North Korea, which could see China's attack as an opportunity for it to start a war with its southern neighbor. If South Korea commits its naval or aerial resources to America now, it leaves itself open to attack. Biden understands this, resulting in South Korea's role being to keep watch over North Korea to ensure it doesn't get involved in the conflict. And now the US has an allied fighting force that's capable of fighting against China in the sea or air. The fleet sets sail. Week 2. Xi has been bombarding Taiwan to no avail. Every attempt to land ground troops on Taiwan's beaches is met with missile strikes and fierce beach combat. Yes, he's slowly whittling away at those defenses, but for each victory he achieves, a road is destroyed or a tunnel collapsed by Taiwan, forcing his troops to divert over difficult terrain to get to Taipei. The few who managed to reach Taiwan's capital have been destroyed in urban warfare. This was supposed to be a quick victory. It had to be. Every day that China doesn't control Taiwan is another day in which American counteroffensives draw nearer. Finally, 2 weeks after his missile launches, Xi faces the prospect of American naval and aerial assets reaching the Taiwan Strait. Worse yet, they're supported by NATO and Japan, neither of which wants to see China gain more influence, be it in the Pacific or the Americas. Worse yet for China, its navy, though larger than America's, doesn't compare in terms of sheer firepower. Though Xi was successful in destroying almost 24 of America's destroyers in his missile barrage, that still leaves 68 to contend with, around 20 more than China has. And although China has more corvettes and patrol boats, neither will withstand the combined naval firepower being brought into the Taiwan Strait. Worse yet for Xi, America has an ace in the hole: its Rapid Dragon tactic. Over the past couple of years, the United States has been retrofitting some of its cargo aircraft so they're capable of dropping pallets of long-range missiles. Each pallet can be stocked up with 30 AGM-158 JASSM cruise missiles, which have a range of between 229 and 1,118 miles, depending on which version of the missile is launched. Stacked into America's MC-130J aircraft, which Xi didn't target as he didn't believe them to be a threat, these pallets start raining cruise missiles down onto the Taiwan Strait. Those missiles serve two purposes. If they hit a Chinese ship, their 990-pound WDU-42B penetrator warheads can easily destroy most targets. But even if they fail to hit, such a large barrage of missiles launched simultaneously will confuse the missile defense systems built into China's larger warships, as well as those in the 3 air bases that are the launching point for China's fighter jets. While the missile defenses are focused on a flurry of JASSM cruise missiles, more targeted strikes can take out targets. The Allied forces turn the tide in the Taiwan Strait. Month 2. Xi has lost the clear passage into Taiwan that he'd established during his initial invasion. He's still getting troops onto the mainland, though each landing is subjected to Taiwanese defenses along with assaults from the US and its allies' navies. Worse yet, he's lost air superiority. In truth, he never really had it. Taiwan's 142 F-16 fighter jets, many of which have been upgraded, may be technologically inferior to China's J-20s. The Infrared Search and Track, or IRST, built into the J-20s, means that it's far more capable of tracking and eliminating a target than the F-16. But Tsai knew this, and knew that support was coming from the US. She's used her F-16s to delay rather than defeat China, just as she's used her beach and urban warfare tactics to keep China from sending hundreds of thousands of troops into Taipei. Now, the US and NATO are in the Taiwan Strait, and they're pushing Chinese forces back to their home country. Constant missile barrages on the Longqian, Jiangsu, and Huan air bases have rendered them practically unusable, making it a struggle for China to get new fighters into the air as quickly as it had managed before. America's aircraft carriers, of which it brings 8 to the Taiwan Strait, can each hold around 75 fighters, bringing the Allied forces to a total of 600 when at full capacity. Add to that the Rapid Dragon strategy, and America and its allies are shutting down every attack China attempts. It's not long before America's Navy cuts off the passage into Taiwan. Cut off from their target, China's naval and air forces begin a retreat, leaving the few thousand Chinese troops still in Taiwan stranded. They'll be picked off by Taiwan's forces in Taipei, assuming they get there. And with the US now firmly entrenched in the Taiwan Strait, it's able to land troops on the island's beaches to attack the remnants of China's forces from the rear. It's a lethal pincer movement that soon puts paid to Xi's invasion. Still, it hasn't all been clear sailing for the US. China has managed to use its strong submarine fleet, with its 6 Shang-class nuclear submarines leading the way, to take out 2 of America's aircraft carriers. It's a difficult loss, especially given that those carriers housed about 150 fighters between them. But America's submarines are just as lethal. Though it has fewer submarines than China, around 60 to China's 78, its crews are better trained and have fewer targets to strike. Both of China's aircraft carriers, brought into the conflict due to the American assaults on its air bases, are taken out, minimizing China's impact from the air. Xi has to face a very real possibility. He's about to lose this war. Month 3. China has stubbornly refused to give in to the overwhelming force being applied to it. The country's navy lies in tatters, with only a fleet of patrol boats guarding its coast to back the few corvettes and frigates it has left. Xi has called his ships back, anticipating an invasion by the United States into the Chinese mainland. Xi has failed to take Taiwan. And in attacking the United States directly, he's only discovered that America's NATO allies take Article 5 very seriously. The same goes for other allies, including Japan and South Korea, which have aided the US both because of their military alliances with the country and because neither wants to see the spread of Chinese influence in the Indo-Pacific. Xi knows he's miscalculated. Now he faces a very big question. Does he launch nuclear weapons? China has around 500 nukes, as well as ICBMs, capable of reaching the continental United States. His country's CSS-4 Mod 2 Mod 3 missiles could do the job thanks to their 8,000-mile range. The DF-41 can also hit the mark, as it's capable of traveling nearly 7,500 miles. But Xi thinks better of it. Launching his nuclear weapons against the United States would mean a response in kind. And while America's Minuteman III ICBMs lack the range of his missiles, the country's submarines and aerial bombers could easily drop nukes all over China if provoked. Ultimately, China is forced to capitulate, though its military would prove a strong match for the United States alone and could even have the potential to defeat its American counterpart. It simply can't stand up to such a powerful united front. Taiwan proved stronger than Xi expected, with his failed invasion meaning plans to reach the American mainland never got off the ground. And with most of Europe, thanks to NATO, gunning for him, he can't escape the fact that he's been overwhelmed. Add to all of this the effects of the sanctions and trade blockades America created within days of him starting his war. They've slowly sapped the morale of the Chinese people, resulting in them being ready for surrender. America wins the war, but it's a win that came at a cost. It will take the US years to rebuild its war-torn navy, and along with its NATO allies, it will be heavily involved in imposing military restrictions on China for years to come. However, it's proven the impact that its cooperative approach to defense can have in a battle against one of its greatest rivals, putting any other major military power that might dare to attack the US on notice in the process. Of course, this is just one of many potential scenarios that could play out if China and the US went to war. It's also optimistic in favor of the US. But what could China do to prevent this series of events from happening? Would they happen at all, or do you think the US may struggle to receive the support it needs from NATO and its allies in Asia? Tell us what you think in the comments below. Now go and check out the US Navy's plan to defeat China in war, or click this other video instead. These days, Xi Jinping and Putin seem to be nothing short of BFFs. But the reality of the relationship between China and Russia is far more dramatic and complex. After decades of dispute over borders and the proper role of communism in society, China and post-Soviet Russia have now forged the closest relationship in their history. The two countries often participate in military drills, share sensitive technology, and have agreed to work together to undermine the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. and have even flirted with plans to build a joint moon base. Chinese purchases of Russian energy have been critical for the latter's economic survival in the wake of international sanctions following its invasion of Ukraine. But Russia's lack of success in its war has also revealed some of the weaknesses in this strategic partnership that is supposedly without limit. China has not given Russia direct military aid, something that the Kremlin has badly wanted. It is willing to give Russia certain parts that it needs for weapons, but will currently not go beyond that. This decision by Xi Jinping is ostensibly to avoid damaging China's already slowing economy with international sanctions that would follow such a move. But what if there was a more cynical principle involved too? What if it wouldn't be all that bad for China if its now undeniably junior strategic partner were to lose the war in Ukraine? Let's look at some of the reasons why Beijing might not be all too upset about a Russian defeat. China and Russia have a shared interest in undermining the post-Cold War international order led by the United States. However, beyond this, there are some tensions within the strategic partnership. Moscow and Beijing have long had border disputes that have at times turned deadly. Border skirmishes broke out in 1969, for example. Although the border dispute was supposedly settled in a 2005 agreement, there are still some tensions. On Valentine's Day 2023, the Chinese Ministry of Natural Resources issued a mandate that 8 cities in Outer or Russian Manchuria, including Vladivostok, should be known by their original Chinese names on future government maps. In Chinese government documents, Russian Vladivostok will now be known as Haishenwai. This move may have been in response to a 2020 message by the Russian embassy to China on Weibo, the Chinese equivalent to X, formerly Twitter, about the 160th anniversary of the founding of Vladivostok. However, Vladivostok had once been Chinese territory and was acknowledged as such by the 1689 Treaty of Nachinsk between Tsarist Russia and the Qing dynasty. Then, during China's weakness in the 19th century, the former forced the latter to sign 2 treaties that granted Vladivostok and the rest of Outer Manchuria to Russia. The 2005 border agreement acknowledged the 19th century borderlines. Up until now, Beijing had an interest in abiding by those borderlines no matter how historically resentful it was to the Chinese leadership. But a Russian defeat in Ukraine would give China more leverage to reassert those old territorial claims and insist on restoring the old 1689 border, especially if the Russian military were to be completely depleted. Reclaiming these lost territories would be beneficial to Beijing in other ways too. For example, if China could retake the southern part of the Khabarovsk Krai in Outer Manchuria, its border would reach the Sea of Japan and the Sea of Okhotsk. Geostrategically, this acquisition would help to mitigate China's being surrounded by the First Island Chain, a set of countries friendly to the United States that stretches from Japan to Indonesia. The First Island Chain creates several choke points that permit the United States and its allies to cut off Chinese shipping, such as the Malacca, Luzon, and Miyako Straits. About 60% of China's energy imports come through these shipping lanes, and if hostilities were to break out over Taiwan, let's say, a blockade by the United States and its allies would destroy the Chinese economy. Securing Outer Manchuria would permit China to seek alternative shipping lanes to the north. Outer Manchuria also has abundant resources. Plentiful hydrocarbon reserves are there, and since China is a country heavily dependent on foreign energy imports, it would naturally desire to produce as many domestic sources as possible. The area is also rich in water, which China desperately needs, as many of its water sources have been polluted by decades of communist mismanagement. The weather is also taking its toll. Years of drought have stretched water reserves further. Some of China's rivers, like the Yangtze, which provides water for more than 400 million people, are losing volume. Between 2018 and 2022, water flows along the Yangtze's main route were 50% below the average. In August 2022, Chinese authorities were forced to discharge 980 million cubic meters of water from reservoirs to replenish the river, and the drought meant that 780,000 people needed government support. Yet, despite the contracting supply, demand is increasing. By 2030, China's demand for water will surpass 800 billion cubic meters. Historically, water shortages have been a cause for war, and China's water problems have made its neighbors like India and Vietnam, which it already has frosty relations with, nervous. Perhaps Russia will need to be added to the list as the war in Ukraine continues without any notion of victory in sight, and with China seeing more and more opportunity to capitalize on its weakened strategic partner. Although China has a historical basis to claim Outer Manchuria, there are other territories further to the north that could prove even worthier for Chinese interest. Outer Manchuria is only part of the Russian Far East. This region is sparsely populated but has many valuable resources. In 2019, Russia launched its 3,000-kilometer-long Power of Siberia pipeline. The pipeline sends natural gas from fields in the Russian Far East directly to China. For China, securing control of the region, its resources and its infrastructure would go a long way to making it energy self-sufficient. Overall, China is investing more heavily in the Russian Far East than the Russian government itself is. For example, it's pledged to spend $28 billion on developing 13 ports and has already spent $14.7 billion on agricultural projects in the region. China is also sending its nationals into the Russian Far East in great numbers, whether the migration is legal or not. Some demographers predict that in 20 to 30 years, there will be more Han Chinese people in the area than ethnic Russians, and there is already tension between the more established locals and the new arrivals. We saw hints of this in 2019, when Siberian authorities had to halt the construction of a bottling plant on Lake Baikal, the world's largest freshwater lake that has nearly 20% of the world's surface fresh water. Locals feared that the China-owned Aquasib company's plans to bottle 190 million liters of water per year and send them to a thirsty Chinese marketplace would drain the lake. Nearly 1 million people signed an online petition against the plant by the middle of March 2019. One local quoted by the New York Times said of the plant, "If we let them, the Chinese will take over. They will just steal all the money and the local people will get nothing." Locals back then were also saying that Chinese tourists referred to Lake Baikal by its ancient Han name, the Northern Sea. It was a sentiment that anticipated the Chinese Ministry of Natural Resources map 4 years later. Additionally, the Russian Far East is a gateway to the Arctic. China has had long Arctic ambitions and has called itself a near-Arctic state. China covets greater influence in the Arctic because of the region's natural resources. These include hydrocarbon reserves, minerals, and fisheries, the latter of which China has severely depleted near its home waters due to overfishing. In addition to being an energy-insecure nation, China is also food insecure, and seizing valuable fishing spots is one of the reasons for its aggressive expansion into the South China Sea. For China, where fish is in high demand, these Arctic fisheries would be extremely valuable. Additionally, China views the Arctic as a potentially useful military and technological testing ground, and its ability to project hard power there would give it greater leverage in its negotiations with the United States. China has invested $90 billion in Arctic Circle-related projects since 2003. In 2018, Beijing announced plans to develop a Polar Silk Road. Its investments, via state-owned entities and other companies with close ties to the Chinese government, include a 12.5% stake in the $1.4 billion Kvanefjeld uranium project in Greenland, a 60% stake in Dreki and Gomur, which are two potential oil and gas shelves in Iceland, a biodiesel plant in Finland, and a 20% stake in the Novatek natural gas project in Russia's Yamal Peninsula. China also attempted to invest in a gold mine in Canada, but Ottawa blocked the move over security concerns. An annexation of the entire Russian Far East would be enormously beneficial for China in terms of resources and geopolitical strength. But that's not the only potential point of contention between these supposed unlimited strategic partners. Central Asia is a point of contention as well. This region is comprised of former Soviet states, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. Although the Soviet Union has collapsed, that didn't mean the end of Moscow's involvement in the region, and it has always considered itself the area's preeminent power. Despite their proximity, these countries are economically isolated from each other, which works to Russia's advantage since they were heavily dependent on remittances from Russia before its invasion of Ukraine. However, Beijing has increasingly muscled in on Moscow's former prerogative in recent years. The region is critical for the success of China's Belt and Road Initiative, as it sits on the crossroads between East Asia and Europe. Xi Jinping has also planned to use the region as a gateway to Pakistan and the Indian Ocean. All of the countries in the region have signed a memorandum of understanding related to the Belt and Road Initiative, and all but Turkmenistan are members of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. China has invested over $1 trillion in its BRI over the last 10 years. The sum could reach up to $8 trillion by the time it's all done. In 2018, China signed contracts worth a cumulative total of $304.9 billion with the Central Asian countries. For China, bringing the backwater Central Asian region out of its isolation is part of its geostrategic competition with the United States. It wants to see a world where more people travel across the Eurasian landmass via its BRI infrastructure projects, like rail lines. In turn, it wants to reduce the amount of people that fly across the Atlantic to the United States. Its moves in Central Asia are meant to help reorient the center of world commerce. Aside from its geostrategic importance to China, the Central Asian countries host an abundance of natural resources. For example, Kazakhstan has an estimated 30 billion barrels of oil. Turkmenistan, meanwhile, has large natural gas reserves, amounting to the world's fifth biggest. China sees this area as important in mitigating its energy disadvantages. For example, Turkmenistan is already China's second-largest supplier of natural gas as of 2021, a convenient arrangement since this route goes overland directly to Chinese territory. More energy coming from Central Asia would lessen the need for it to import its oil and natural gas through the contested waters and choke points of the First Island chain. A greater Chinese presence in the Central Asian energy market would also give it more leverage in its negotiations with the European Union, which has long sought to deepen ties in the region to counteract its dependence on Russian oil and natural gas. Central Asia also has vast mineral resources. Tajikistan is one of the world's largest silver deposits in Koni-Mansour. Tajikistan is also rich in gold, as is Kyrgyzstan. Central Asia boasts large deposits of rare earth elements too. These 17 materials, like erbium and thulium, are vital for the modern digital economy. Everything from wind turbines to household appliances use them. Studies from the World Bank and other organizations suggest that demand for rare earth elements will increase between 2 and 8 times over the coming decades. China currently controls between 50 and 60% of the mining supply and about 90% of the intermediate processing stage of these elements. Even so, internal demand in China has outstripped supply as of March 2022. Central Asia is a means to secure that supply for the greater demand. Despite its prevalence of rare earth elements, this industry is relatively underdeveloped in Central Asia, and the region continues to depend heavily on its energy sector. Greater Chinese investment in the region with the aim of diversifying the economies of the Central Asian region would give Beijing even more of a voice there. There is another problem for Russia, as China has much more to offer the Central Asian countries economically than their supposed benefactor. This was true before the sanctions over the invasion of Ukraine and is even truer today. China already invests more in the region than Russia does, with plans to invest further. Up until now, Russia has been able to live with China's activities in Central Asia because it's been more interested in security matters than in economic ones. The two countries have also cooperated on security matters. For example, following the Taliban's regaining of power in Afghanistan in 2021, Russia and China initiated a close bilateral dialogue to monitor the situation and conduct joint counterterrorism exercises. Containing the Taliban to Afghanistan's borders is an item of high priority for both Moscow and Beijing. Experts are divided as to whether this power-sharing arrangement in Central Asia is coincidental or down to an informal policy understanding between the two big guys in the region. However, China's security plays in Central Asia are growing too. In October 2021, China took full control of a military base near Tajikistan's border with Afghanistan. The base is also near China's small border of less than 100 kilometers with Afghanistan at the Wakhan Corridor. The base is manned not by China's People's Liberation Army, but rather its People's Armed Police Force. This is the same unit responsible for internal security in its western Xinjiang province, where according to many international governments like the United States and United Kingdom, China is perpetrating a genocide on its Uyghur Muslim minority. Meanwhile, officials in Tajikistan have announced that China will build another base, to the tune of $10 million, in the eastern Gorno-Badakhshan Autonomous Province near the Pamir Mountains. Chinese troops were not to be stationed there, but that could change. China has long feared Islamic terrorism and separatism in Xinjiang, sometimes irrationally. Its security interest in Central Asia is an extension of Beijing's desire to keep these forces under control. With the region becoming more economically dependent on China, Beijing's future terms could include more of a military presence there. This would especially be the case if Russia, the traditional security guarantor in Central Asia, sees its military slowly and steadily bled white in Ukraine.
China's aid to Russia in the war seems designed to make Moscow increasingly dependent on Beijing. China has become the world's largest importer of Russian energy, and this has been critical for the latter's ability to make up at least some of the shortfall coming from the Western sanctions and loss of the European market. But this is not altruism on part of the Chinese. China is using its currency, the yuan, in most of its purchases. As a result, total Russian exports being conducted in yuan jumped from 0.5% prior to February 22 to 14% in October 2023. This arrangement is convenient for Beijing as it strengthens the yuan. It's not so great for Moscow, as the Chinese energy purchases are steadily leaving Russia with a huge amount of yuan reserves that are of limited use on the global market. This reality makes Russia even more dependent on China, because it won't be able to make many international purchases with its vast yuan stockpile. The only country that will unhesitatingly take that currency is, you guessed it, China. Meanwhile, what passes as China's military aid seems designed to keep the war a prolonged dispute. The parts and other equipment China is supplying to Russia has so far been enough to prevent its military from being defeated outright, but it's not enough to tip the scales in favor of its supposed strategic partner. In March 2023, Xi Jinping met Vladimir Putin in a summit in Moscow. He did not pledge increased military aid to Russia, which Putin strongly desired. China did release a 12-point peace plan at the meeting. Point 10 was favorable to Russia, as it announced China's opposition to unilateral sanctions unauthorized by the UN Security Council. This is convenient since China and Russia have 2 of the 5 permanent seats on that body with the associated veto power. The rest of the peace plan was vague, however. Conveniently vague for China. The first point of the plan about national sovereignty said that the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of all countries must be effectively upheld. The statement further encouraged all countries to follow international norms. The statement and the rest of the plan did not mention Russia's supposed annexation of the territories it occupies in eastern Ukraine. Does China recognize these new territories or not? No one knows, presumably including Putin. Instead, China encouraged further dialogue to end the war, secure supply chains, keep nuclear power plants safe, and honor the agreements signed by Russia, Ukraine, Turkey, and the UN on the export of grain through the Black Sea. With Russia withdrawing from this agreement later in the year, and with its threats to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, these statements are at least not as encouraging as Vladimir Putin would have liked. It seems there are limits to the supposed no-limits partnership after all. China's position on Ukraine is deliberately vague, in order to give it the biggest advantage. Long before the invasion of Ukraine, China had become by far the stronger of the 2 parties within the partnership. Now it's making Russia much more dependent on its market, while it gets to keep its options open. If Russia somehow manages to eke out something it can claim as a victory in Ukraine, or at least doesn't lose, China gets to benefit from the new status quo, as victory for the Kremlin will be Pyrrhic. Sanctions will be unlikely to lift anytime soon, and China will be able to capitalize on Russia's isolation. Perhaps one day it will force Russia to support everything it does in Central Asia, or grant it vast privileges in the Russian Far East. More dramatically, China could one day claim that it must march into the historical or now majority ethnically Chinese territories in the Russian Far East to protect them, using the exact same justification that Russia used to invade Ukraine. This is less likely, but it wouldn't be the first time that China made outrageous territorial claims and used military force to secure them. All in all, China and Russia are like-minded authoritarian countries who want to expand their clout at America's expense. However, as Russia weakens while China becomes stronger in their relative balance of power, it would not be surprising to see Beijing play its newfound strength to the hilt. As the Kremlin is already learning, there is a high price to be paid for friendship with the Chinese Communist Party. But what do you think? Will the war in Ukraine leave Russia vulnerable to Chinese ambitions? Could China one day treat its supposed strategic partner as a vassal state, or even seize its territory? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. India has lured China into a trap. For years, the 2 powerhouse nations have been involved in a cat-and-mouse battle to gain ascendancy over the much-coveted Indian Ocean region. Only now, through canny political maneuvering and the signing of many trade and military treaties, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has outwitted his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping, all of which has put India in pole position to control one of the most sought-after areas in the world. Make no mistake though, this isn't something Beijing will take lying down.
and it's something the rest of the world will ignore at its peril. At this point in the video, you would be forgiven for feeling slightly confused. Aren't China and India partners in one of the biggest intergovernmental associations in the world, BRICS? The answer is, of course, yes. So why have India and China become embroiled in what many see as dangerous Cold War-style posturing and rhetoric, not to mention a huge buildup of military and strategic strength? In a geopolitical context, the answer to that question is as murky as it is complex, but the ultimate goal is simple enough to explain: the aforementioned riches associated with the Indian Ocean and everything that goes with it. The importance of this region and who ultimately controls it is nothing new, however. Way back in 1897, Alfred Thayer, an admiral in the US Navy, made this bold prediction: whoever controls the Indian Ocean will dominate Asia. The destiny of the world will be decided on its waters. From as early as the 3rd century BCE, the Indian Ocean trade routes have connected Southeast Asia, India, Arabia, and East Africa. At present, more than 2/3 of the world's oil is transported through the region's waters. But it's not just oil exports that rely on the crucial trade route, but coal exports too. 3 nations with developing economies, Australia, Indonesia, and South Africa, now account for more than half of global coal exports, shipping much of it across the Indian Ocean to India, China, Japan, and South Korea. And what about the fisheries industry? According to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization (FAO), a truly staggering 11.3 million tons of fish were caught in 2010, about 14.6% of the world's catch. In the same year, 6 Indian Ocean nations, India, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Thailand, Egypt, and Myanmar, supplied over 11.3 million tons of fish between them, as much as the rest of the regions combined. The Indian Ocean is not only one of the most lucrative maritime trade and fishing routes on the planet, but also home to vast natural resources, the majority of which have yet to be exploited to the full. According to Insight on India (IAS), nodules containing nickel, cobalt, and iron, and gargantuan sulfide deposits of manganese, copper, iron, zinc, silver, and gold are all present in huge quantities on the seabed. But it doesn't end there. The sediments found in the Indian Ocean are important sources of titanium, zirconium, tin, zinc, and copper. To qualify, back in 2017, the Indian Ocean economies accounted for 35.5% of global iron production, 17.8% of world gold production, 16.8% of the world's proven oil reserves, and 27.9% of proven natural gas reserves. That's just a small example of exactly what's at stake here, and why India and China have set themselves on a seeming collision course that could have huge global ramifications. Before we dig even deeper into this most intriguing of geopolitical chess matches, however, we need to give ourselves some demographic context. China and India are 2 of the biggest nations in the world.
China has a population of 1,425,347,415. India, 1,425,775,850.
In terms of landmass, China boasts around 9.6 million square meters, about 3.7 million square miles, and India approximately 3.29 million square meters, about 1.2 million square miles. Last year, China's gross domestic product (GDP) was $17.52 trillion. India's GDP for the same period was $3.75 trillion. Militarily, China has over 2 million active servicemen and women and a stockpile of 500 nuclear warheads. India has around 1.2 million active servicemen and women and 164 nuclear weapons, with the present capacity to increase that number to 200 in the near future. We're talking about true global heavyweights in every respect. But how did we get to where we are today? In 5 words, the Belt and Road Initiative. Back in 2012, Wang Jixi of the Institute of International and Strategic Studies at Peking University published a paper that would reshape Beijing's foreign policy objectives. In essence, his paper, Marching West, recommended that China turn away from its powerful allies of the United States in the East, the familiar faces of Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and the Philippines, and focus more on Central Asia and the Middle East. When Xi came to power a year later, he initiated a new economic program, later known as the Belt and Road Initiative. Around that time, China had just started to send goods to European markets on trains that followed the 2,000-year-old Silk Road routes across the steppes of Central Asia. When the other nations in Southeast Asia asked to be included, Xi was only too happy to oblige with a maritime Silk Road link between Southeast Asia and South Asia to East Africa, and thus the Belt and Road Initiative was born. So why would this project lead to so much tension between China and India, especially when you consider the international investment the project attracted? By 2019, Hungary, Portugal, and Italy, a member of the group of 7 leading industrialized democracies, had signed agreements to cooperate. Saudi Arabia, Iran, and countries across Latin America and Africa quickly followed suit. Surely a new lucrative trade route is a good and positive development for all countries concerned. On paper, yes, it is. But as alluded to at the start of the video, there are much bigger prizes at stake here. India's concerns about the Belt and Road Initiative are pressing and manifold. First and foremost, Modi fears that participating in the program would only strengthen China's strategic influence in the region. Naturally, this is something New Delhi wants to avoid at all costs. Granted, improving trade routes with China is all well and good, but India is rightly concerned about its own security and geopolitical interests. India has also expressed concern about the financial implications. The more vociferous critics in New Delhi argue that the Belt and Road Initiative gives China unfair leverage over other countries. If left unchallenged, this could lead to economic and political dependence on China, and eventually result in Beijing expanding its military presence in the Indian Ocean region. But how exactly? Over recent years, China has adopted a dubious and, some would say, mercenary policy whereby Beijing offers financial, infrastructural, or military aid to a lesser nation. However, the repayment terms have an ambiguous dynamic attached to them. In a CNN report from March 2023, China is said to have loaned massive sums to countries across Asia, Europe, and Africa, extending its global influence through mega infrastructure projects and becoming one of the world's biggest creditors in the process. According to Brad Parks, co-author of a joint study from the World Bank, Harvard Kennedy School, Kiel Institute for the World Economy, and the US-based research lab Aid Data, Beijing has created a new global system for cross-border rescue lending, but it has done so in an opaque and uncoordinated way. But what are we talking about in terms of figures? China has spent over $240 billion bailing out 22 countries involved in the Belt and Road Infrastructure project, including Argentina, Pakistan, Kenya, and Turkey. An act of global altruism, or a cynical way to exploit countries in their time of need and make them indebted to you in more ways than just the financial. If we adopt the latter mindset, we can construct the following hypothetical situation. Your country is one of those bailed out by Beijing. Naturally, you're hugely grateful, even more so when Xi doesn't come hammering on your door for repayment anytime soon. But what happens if China's leader makes a request to, say, build a military base on your territory, one that might, for instance, make people in New Delhi very nervous indeed? A redefinition of the classic rock and hard place conundrum. And hence, we get to the crux of the matter, two behemoth nations with their eyes on the same massive prizes. But perhaps most tellingly of all, and this is as symbolic as it is of practical geographical concern, the route of the Belt and Road Initiative passes through hotly disputed Kashmiri territory that both India and Pakistan stake historical claims, namely Gilgit-Baltistan. This ethnically diverse Himalayan region was mired in controversy long before Pakistan won its independence from the UK in 1947. Under the partition plan contained in the Indian Independence Act, Kashmir was free to accede to either India or Pakistan. Hari Singh, the Maharaja or local ruler, initially wanted Kashmir to be independent. However, in October 1947, he chose to join India in return for its help against aggression from Pakistani tribespeople. War broke out. India sought the United Nations intercession to decide the dispute, and even though a ceasefire ensued, the situation has remained volatile up until the present day, with a full-blown, if short-lived war breaking out in 1999, with tens of thousands of lives being lost. The eventual creation of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor (CPEC) in 2015 only added fuel to the fire. India felt this was a direct violation of its territorial sovereignty and was the main reason why India refused to participate in the Belt and Road Initiative itself. Fast forward to today and tensions are still running high. In a report in the Hindustan Times from February 2024, former Ambassador Vishnu Prakash claimed that India is decoupling from China and it was no longer business as usual between the two countries. Furthermore, he alleged that there is an unholy alliance between China and Pakistan that will thwart India's initiatives. However, the Belt and Road Initiative is only one part of the puzzle. As we'll shortly explain, both countries have been incredibly active in recent decades. Slowly but surely, they have attempted to gain a strategic stranglehold on the region. If China made one move, India was quick to react with a move of their own. And while China may arguably have the stronger allies, it's India who looks to have put the better military strategy into place to secure their short, medium, and long-term objectives. At the top of the video, we made a pretty bold and wide-reaching claim. India has lured China into a trap. But in every game of cat and mouse, there is constant pursuit, near captures, and repeated escapes. Never more so than when the diamond necklace and string of pearls strategies collided. Confused? Don't worry. Despite the somewhat elaborate imagery conjured by the respective names, these two strategies are easy to understand, especially if you visualize a map with a diamond or pearl adornment draped around the countries involved. Firstly, let's look at China's so-called string of pearls strategy for the Indian Ocean region. According to a report from China Briefing, China is primarily focused on strengthening its ties with Sri Lanka. Why? Simply put, China needs to secure foreign oil and trade routes that are critical to its expansion in the area. How? By establishing an increased level of influence along sea routes through investment, port development, and diplomacy. These investments extend from Hainan Island in the South China Sea through the littorals of the Straits of Malacca. It includes port developments in Chittagong, Bangladesh, Sittwe, Koko, Hyanggi, Kalkpyu, Mergui, and Sadek Kyun in Myanmar, Liam Chabang in Thailand, and Sihanoukville in Cambodia. A wide net indeed. To give you a better idea of the scale of the strategy, these routes run across the Indian Ocean, Sri Lanka, the Maldives, Pakistan's Gwadar port, and islands within the Arabian Sea, and into the Persian Gulf. But it hasn't all been plain sailing, far from it, and as the old saying goes, necessity is often the mother of creation. The lack of progress on the Kra Canal project in Thailand, which would directly link the Indian Ocean with the South China Sea, has been cited as a motivating factor in the development of this policy. Ultimately, it will provide a greater presence for China along the sea lines of communication that now anchor the country directly to the Middle East. Naturally, this has proved incredibly disquieting for both India and the United States. They don't know whether this strategy is intended to cement supply lines and trade routes or whether China is aiming for regional supremacy. But if history teaches us anything, it's best to plan for the worst eventuality. That way you'll be prepared to act if circumstances go against you. India's response? The diamond necklace strategy. What could easily be described as a counter-encirclement strategy against the Chinese expansion we outlined a moment ago. Originally coined by former Foreign Secretary Lalit Mansingh, India has opted for a multi-pronged program, including the building of ports and extensive coastal surveillance radar (CSR) systems to track Chinese warships and submarines. Ultimately, this will solidify defense ties, expand bilateral relations with South Asian countries, island nations in the Indian Ocean region, and Southeast Asian nations, and include regular military exercises with US, Japanese, and Australian naval forces. But what will this achieve exactly? First and foremost, important military and strategic agreements with Vietnam, Japan, the Philippines, South Korea, Indonesia, Singapore, and Thailand have all been signed, all of which will help India fight back against Chinese expansion in the region. Just as importantly, the strategy will help India access and build ports crucial for its own trade initiatives. But where will these ports likely be located? India is developing the Chabahar port in Iran, opening a new land-sea route to Central Asian countries and bypassing Pakistan. Strategically close to the Chinese Gwadar port, it's also located close to the Strait of Hormuz. This will put India in a great position since it overlooks the Gulf of Oman, a crucially important oil supply route. India is also building deep-sea ports in Indonesia, Bangladesh, and Myanmar with similar strategic objectives. Furthermore, Modi has signed agreements to access naval facilities in Oman and Singapore. This first facility is again close to the Strait of Hormuz, where over 30% of oil exports travel through. The second, on the Changi Naval Base in Singapore, is strategically located close to the Strait of Malacca. And it doesn't stop there. In 2022, India strengthened its historic links to Mongolia and added another diamond to its strategic necklace, an alliance too close for comfort, no doubt, for China. According to India's Economic Times, India has agreed to fund a new greenfield oil refinery project in South Gobi to the tune of $1.2 billion. No small change. India also knows the importance of building solid radar networks. For that reason, they have done deals with Bangladesh, the Maldives, Sri Lanka, Mauritius, and the Seychelles. By constructing ports and signing bilateral agreements, India hopes to improve trade ties with the respective nations and open different trade routes. all of which will help India to stymie Chinese influence in these countries and promote India's own economic objectives along the way. Even more worrying from a Chinese perspective, India is also a member of the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, Quad, an informal alliance of nations comprising the US, Australia, India, and Japan. While not a formal alliance, the Quad represents a strong and real challenge to Chinese hegemony on the global stage. Ostensibly, this group was set up after the Indian Ocean tsunami of 2004. Since then, however, one of the group's main objectives, even if not overtly stated, is to curb China's growing influence in the Indian Ocean and both the East and South China Seas. Back in 2022, right after the COVID-19 crisis, Japan hosted a summit to discuss the post-pandemic world. According to a report by the Council on Foreign Relations, CFR, the leaders spoke of their resolve to uphold the international rules-based order where countries are free from all forms of military, economic, and political coercion. This broadside was clearly aimed at China's growing use of its economic might to achieve political gains. In that respect, Australia, India, and Japan have all recently felt China's coercive pressures. Speaking of Japan, China's historical adversary, Tokyo signed a trade deal with India back in 2011. The India-Japan Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement effectively eliminates tariffs on 90% of Japanese exports to India, including auto parts and electric appliances, and 97% of imports from India, including agricultural and fisheries products. But how does India's membership of these organizations and the signing of these trade deals affect its standing in BRICS? As mentioned at the top of the video, China and India aren't just antagonistic nations locking horns like rutting stags, but members of the same intergovernmental alliance. Founded in 2009 as BRIC, it wasn't until South Africa joined in 2010 that it became BRICS. The basic objective of the alliance was to give emerging economies more influence in international politics. Whether the group has achieved that objective is still up for debate. What can't be denied, with the inclusion of more states, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, effectively joined on January 1, 2024, is the collective size and influence of the alliance. Let's give you the facts and figures to back that claim up. The expanded group has a combined population of about 3.5 billion, or 45% of the world's inhabitants. Their economies are worth more than $28.5 trillion, or about 28% of the global economy. Over recent years, however, India has been an increasingly marginalized voice in the BRICS structure. Why? Quite simply, India has become involved with too many strategic partnerships. As a result, Modi has often found himself to be the odd man out when it comes to making many key decisions. In short, you can't be everybody's friend and ally, and it's impossible to keep Washington, Moscow, and Beijing happy when pursuing political, economic, and military agendas diametrically opposed to each of their best interests. So has Modi spread India too thin and in the process watered down the country's influence in key strategic decision-making on a global level? And do the other member states of these organizations now see India as an unreliable ally? The answer? Probably. But high-stakes political maneuvering is nothing if not a tightrope act. After all, the rewards are huge. Let's look at an illustrative example from the Quad summit mentioned above. Naturally, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the humanitarian crisis in Europe it precipitated were high on the agenda. Tellingly, India found themselves in an incredibly awkward situation again, and for all the wrong reasons. As soon as Putin launched his invasion, all member states, apart from India, imposed brutal sanctions on Russia. But not only that, Modi failed to publicly condemn Putin's actions to the wider international community. Like Pakistan, India abstained from joining a UN resolution. To put that into the appropriate context, only Belarus, Eritrea, North Korea, and Syria openly refused to sign the resolution. Hardly the best company to be keeping in the broader global context. And again, we have to ask the reason why. India is buying oil from Russia at a heavily discounted rate. While a report from Outlook contends that this is a means to secure India's energy security interests and shouldn't therefore be politicized in any way, shape, or form, it doesn't look good to the watching world. And it's something that won't have escaped Beijing's notice. With that in mind, what of India's future in BRICS and the other alliances it has joined in recent decades? For the time being, it looks as if Modi will keep to the status quo if possible, as he sees membership in organizations with such opposing strategic objectives as an unavoidable inconvenience. Whether that will lead to uncomfortable compromises or unavoidable confrontations later down the line remains to be seen. More important for India is its continued expansion and vigilance, as the global stakes couldn't be any higher. Now we are coming to the end of the video, we have a much clearer picture of the current situation and just how India has reacted to China's expansion into the Indian Ocean region. Through the tireless work of its leader, India has responded to each geopolitical roll of the dice with a decisive move of its own. Be it in strategic, militaristic, economic, or political alliances, the diamond necklace looks as if it could put China on a tight leash for many years to come. But what do you think about the state of play at the present time? Has India really drawn China into a trap with its military strategy? Or do you think Beijing has something else up its sleeve? With so much at stake, is an outbreak of hostilities between the two nations now almost inevitable? If so, who would come out on top? Both have powerful allies in the region, and both are huge military powers in their own rights. Will the United States and Russia intercede? We only need to look at the destabilizing international effect of the war in Ukraine to know that another conflict is in no one's best interests. Tell us what you think in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more military content from military experts.
What do Ukraine and China have in common? Let's start with geopolitical significance. Both China and Ukraine hold strategic geopolitical importance. China is the world's most populous country, with a population of approximately 1,426,000,000 in 2023, and the second largest economy, preceded by the US. Ukraine, on the other hand, is the second largest country in Europe by land area, with a total area of approximately 232,900 square miles. This means that the second largest country in Europe is roughly 28 times smaller than Europe's largest country, Russia, which spans an area of roughly 6,606,000 square miles. Then there's the fact that both China and Ukraine are connected through China's Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, making Ukraine an important transit country for the BRI's land-based routes, and thus linking China with Europe. However, lately, a new and deeply disturbing commonality has arisen between both countries: Putin's war on Ukraine. And as bad as it's been for Ukraine itself, it has also been downright disastrous for China. But why? In what way? Let's find out. In today's world, it pays to have friends in high places. Fortunately for the Western world, and especially Ukraine, Russia has virtually none of them. China, however, is among the few. The two neighbor nations are strategic partners, linked economically by $190 billion of annual trade, and politically by virtue of their authoritarian, like-minded leaders. Over the past decades, the two countries have forged closer bilateral ties. Both sides, moreover, view the United States as a hostile actor bent on containing their territorial and cultural ambitions. On the surface, they're like two geopolitical peas in a pod. But all is not as rosy as it seems. Once aspirational partners of Western democracies content, even keen to assimilate these two Eurasian powers into their economic, cultural, and political spheres, Putin's invasion of Ukraine has changed everything. Russia's once vaunted military has, in many circles, become a laughingstock, and this has reflected poorly on China, whose own extraterritorial designs on its neighbors are well known throughout the world. Most peace-loving nations today view both as a threat, though certainly not on equal levels. One US official perhaps summarized it best: Russia is a hurricane. It comes on hard and fast. China, on the other hand, is climate change. Long, slow, pervasive. Today, China continues to foster close relations with Putin, even though the Russian president headlines the International Criminal Court's arrest warrant list. It's a bad look. But the PRC isn't willing to throw the Kremlin out with the bathwater just yet. Today, we'll discuss why they might want to reconsider that decision, and just how Russia's reverses in Ukraine may influence China's strategic calculus moving forward. Putin's illegal war has been an eye-opening experience for the world. China, as we all know, harbors territorial claims on Taiwan, its independent island neighbor. As such, the United States, Taiwan, and the vast majority of the civilized world place China's ambitions in the same category as Putin's toward Ukraine. Ever since Russian forces stormed across the border in February 2022, the United States and its allies kept a closer eye on China. If the Ukrainian invasion went as well as many thought it would be fair to assume China might feel empowered to attack Taiwan, especially as Europe and the US were distracted by Russia. We can safely say now, over a year in, and knowing what he knows about the complexities of modern joint and combined arms warfare, Xi would have to be stupid to authorize an unprovoked amphibious invasion of Taiwan. So far, there's only one dictator dumb enough to do that, and look how that's going. With each passing day, the PRC is witnessing Russia sink unfathomable amounts of blood and treasure into an almost unwinnable war of attrition. In the wreckage of Bakhmut, the atrocities of Bucha, and the discontent growing in the hearts of babushkas far and wide, China's leadership sees its future plans of easily seizing Taiwan slipping away. War is a hard teacher. For now, China may be content to sit back and learn all it can, while it can. Why then has Putin's invasion become a disaster for China's future plans? Let's dive in. No matter how you cut it, almost every lesson in Ukraine spells bad news for China. So far, China has adopted a unique, long-term, over-the-horizon strategic approach in its posture towards Taiwan. Its primary tactic has not been as in-your-face as you would expect from a rising superpower accustomed to throwing its economic and cultural weight around. But militarily, China has adapted something called gray zone operations to achieve its strategic ends. Gray zone operations are just like they sound, actions on the spectrum between peace and war. These small, compounding confrontations are not designed to escalate into a full-scale war, but they certainly can. They tend to be employed by powerful actors bent on achieving objectives that ordinarily might be illegal or too difficult to do all at once, and often take a variety of forms. These can include cyber attacks or covert espionage, political propaganda and misinformation campaigns, election rigging, economic warfare and sanctions, proxy wars, and the funding of destabilizing insurgencies, or the gradual weakening of alliances and partnerships. One of China's preferred tactics is to slowly increase the number of times it flies into Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone, the internationally recognized airspace around the island, until it almost becomes normal. Along with this, China has recently sent more and more vessels up to and even over the Taiwan Strait median line, demarcating the boundary between both countries. It has deployed men and material onto smaller island chains, man-made and otherwise, in the South China Sea to intimidate and pressure their neighbor. It harasses foreign vessels traversing these waters too, as a Chinese naval vessel recently did to a Philippine Coast Guard patrol just 105 miles off its own coastline. Gray zone operations take place independent from one another, on different days, at different times, just infrequently enough for the world to forget about them in our 24-hour news cycle. It's pretty smart. If China did everything at once, the world would label it as even more of a belligerent and untrustworthy actor than it already does. Collectively, these acts normalize displays of Chinese power, chip away at Taiwan's defensive resolve, condition the West into accepting higher levels of belligerency, and set China up for its ultimate aim. For anyone paying attention, the world has seen this type of behavior before. Vladimir Putin utilized gray zone tactics prior to and during its first invasion of Ukraine in 2014, dispatching mercenaries and Russian forces in anonymous green uniforms with no markings to do his bidding, destabilizing the local government and paving the way for Russia's annexation of Crimea. Putin told everyone he had no idea who these little green men were, as if. Their disguise as local pro-Russian separatists enabled Putin to claim plausible deniability for their involvement, giving him the ability to achieve his geopolitical aim without officially escalating the crisis into an unwinnable war. That didn't last long. Despite the Kremlin's reliance on grey zone operations, it ultimately could not get everything it wanted without a bigger, pre-planned invasion. And here, China will have certainly taken note. Before 2022, the West could only respond to what seemed a measured, limited invasion with measured, limited sanctions. China can, and does, expect the same when it pulls similar stunts in the South China Sea. The United States, as yet, hasn't been able to do much to challenge China's construction of artificial islands or its repeated violation of Taiwanese airspace, since it is short of a pronounced, conventional invasion. China can harass and weaken Taiwan in limited ways and still not be seen as overt aggressors. The West can apply economic, political, and diplomatic pressure, but China has weathered this type of response for decades now. Russia's switch from grey zone tactics to full-blown warfare has given China insight into the West's response, and it probably doesn't like what it has seen. The world rallied behind Ukraine, pouring billions of dollars worth of arms and aid into the fight. Its alliances grew stronger, its commitment to defending vulnerable nations, even indirectly, more firm. China now knows what it can expect in a similar Taiwan contingency. If they had plans to invade in the near future, they have probably shelved them for now, and rightly so. Just another reason why Putin's war has not only benefited the West, but also deterred China in the East. There are other lessons to be taken from Russia's invasion. Chief among them, China has learned that size isn't everything. China's military is excellent on paper. It has 2 million active soldiers, 500,000 more than the US. It recently launched its third aircraft carrier, which, compared to anyone besides the US, is a decent number, and now boasts the largest navy in the world by pure numbers. Its defense budget is surpassed only by the US. It has some of the world's best air-to-air hypersonic missiles and attack drones. But China sees that Russia too once boasted similar stats. From Ukraine, China has learned that material and numerical superiority doesn't automatically translate to victory. If it wants to successfully invade Taiwan, it will need far, far more. Russia had by far the more achievable territorial ambitions when it invaded Ukraine compared to China's designs on Taiwan. It had amassed so many tanks and mechanized infantry on Ukraine's border, it was easy to assume, and most did, that Kyiv would quickly capitulate. The countries are right next to each other. Russia had excellent railway access into the country. Save a few key waterways, Ukraine lacks natural defensive features. Russia even had a friendly partner in Belarus, whose territory it used to stage its attack. China would have to surmount a logistical Mount Everest if it commits to a similar invasion plan in Taiwan. Amphibious operations are among the most difficult to pull off, combining the intricacies of air, land, and sea warfare and the logistical challenge of transporting vehicles, men, and weapons across open water to contested shores. China has to cross the 100-mile-wide Strait of Taiwan first and foremost, a span in which it will be vulnerable to barrages of artillery and anti-ship missiles. If the fate of the Moskva, the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, is any indication, modern anti-ship missiles can in fact exercise a massively disproportionate influence over the battlefield. When it gets onto the island of Taiwan, assuming it can actually establish a beachhead, it will have to establish and sustain huge stockpiles of supplies shipped over in secure convoys, defend itself from what will undoubtedly be an onslaught of Taiwanese artillery, and withstand any counterattacks that come. Superior numbers may not be enough to win out. Ultimately, the outcome of Russia's invasion is bad news for China for this one simple reason. You cannot intimidate your way to victory in war, especially when the enemy you fight has the moral high ground. Resistance will be fierce and pronounced. Taiwan will not give up simply because China outnumbers them. China has learned other lessons from Ukraine, among them the importance of training in the outcome of military engagements. Just as material superiority won't automatically translate to victory, armies will always struggle to overcome deficiencies in training. It is an indisputable fact that Ukrainian troops are far better trained than their Russian counterparts, mercenary, conscript, or otherwise. Most of Russia's most experienced, best-trained troops, commanders and non-commissioned officers are now dead, and Putin's repeated mobilization efforts have starkly revealed the deficiencies in Russian military training, whether the alarming lack of weapons, vehicles, and live ammunition to train on, unsuitable training sites, poor leadership, a chronic lack of technological enablers, or concern for the general well-being and training up of cohesive collective units. On the other hand, Ukraine has integrated a vast spectrum of foreign munitions, weapons, drones, and technology, eschewing older Soviet models and tactics for more effective Western ones. And that, in tandem with the intelligence they receive on a daily basis, has helped deliver several stunning victories. But while we often talk about the technology behind Ukraine's success, it's certainly no silver bullet. Western weapons are hard to maintain, at least in Ukraine. being both subject to breakdown and difficult to replace when stocks run low. In this discussion, we tend to forget the human element, how hard it is to deploy and use modern weapons effectively. Among other things, Ukrainian troops are road testing real-time online information and networking systems, drone jamming guns, and maritime remote-controlled kamikaze boats, Western systems that take a real know-how and expertise to operate within a combined arms setting. They are improving their intelligence and surveillance gathering efforts. They are becoming experts at psychological warfare, joint operations, and sustainment logistics. It's been a whirlwind crash course, to say the least. But they have not worked alone. As far back as 2014, Ukrainian officers were receiving Western training, especially from the United States, Great Britain, Canada, and other European nations. As early as 1993, Ukrainian armed forces were training in the US through the United States National Guard's State Partnership Program, learning to deliver mission-type orders, empower Ukrainian soldiers to make on-the-fly battlefield decisions, and using realistic combat exercises to hone the skills and wartime resilience of Ukrainian personnel. More recently, tens of thousands of Ukrainian officers have received crash courses in modern joint war fighting in Britain, Germany, Poland, and as part of the US Army Europe's Joint Multinational Training Group Ukraine, a blended task force of Americans, Poles, Lithuanians, Brits, Canadians, and other soldiers established in 2015 to mentor and advise Ukrainian battalions in the art of combined arms warfare. These train-the-trainer programs, arguably more than the weapons and munitions themselves, are conferring Ukraine a distinct battlefield advantage. The bad news for China is that Taiwan joined a similar US-led program in 2022 and have been integrating Western-built weapons systems far longer than that. Every day that goes by, their military will glean lessons from the best forces in the world, making an invasion that much harder to pull off. Speaking of lessons, it is a well-known fact that Russia underestimated the extent to which Ukraine would receive Western assistance after it was invaded, and China now knows that even if the United States, its allies and partners do not expressly commit hard military power to fight side by side with Taiwanese forces in the event of an invasion, it can be sure that the likelihood the Western world will assist Taiwan in some way is extremely high. Geographic distance from an international hotspot no longer hinders the degree of foreign aid or the level of intervention in the way it once did. Even though a vast Pacific expanse separates Taiwan from the United States, it would still send crucial military and humanitarian aid if China invades. Witnessing the astronomical sums of money donated by NATO member countries to Ukraine will send shivers down Xi Jinping's spine. Thanks to Russia, the West is once more alert to the tangible threat of authoritarianism. Gone are the days of ambivalence or neutrality when it comes to ensuring territorial integrity. China's hopes of the United States staying aloof from a Taiwanese confrontation are long gone. The US has proven willing to send state-of-the-art tanks, high-tech weapons, and advisors to help Ukraine, currently facing its second most pronounced national security threat. We predict it will offer the same assistance, if not more, to Taiwan. This leads to another reason why Russia's experience should send warning signals to China. Just as it has drawn insight from the West's reaction to Russia's invasion, it must recognize that the West, too, has been learning what works and what doesn't when countries threaten to invade their neighbor. China may have taken some confidence from the initial response to Russia's decision to amass troops on Ukraine's border. The West could only threaten to proportionately punish Russian aggression in the vaguest terms, since, technically, it was all still hypothetical. The threat and implementation of economic sanctions was serious, but far from insurmountable. Russia had hoped to win the war quickly and incorporate Ukraine's vast resources and manpower, thus shielding itself from the worst effects of sanctions. Yes, they might temporarily make average Russians uncomfortable in the short term. The long-term strategic benefits of a rapid, decisive victory, however, couldn't be ignored. Once the war was over and Russia controlled Ukraine, it's fair to say that Russia might be able to slowly reduce the impact of sanctions and re-engage in dialogue with the West, as it had after it invaded and annexed Crimea in 2014. In a perfect world, China foresees a similar outcome for its own invasion. But Russian setbacks have shown that once the war spirals out of control and the aggressor finds itself on the losing side, the West will move from mere sanctions to deterrence through denial, deploying rapid response troops to the region to prevent things from escalating further as a preventative measure. Because the threat of sanctions was not enough to stop Russia from invading, and when they were implemented they did not alter Russia's behavior to the extent many had hoped, it is possible the West will simply double down on not only arming Taiwan with the weapons and training it needs ahead of time, but redoubling its own presence. This is what Japan, Australia, and other Indo-Pacific nations have already been doing for months now. You can be sure China would much rather deal with sanctions than the latter. Another takeaway is actually a corollary to the idea that the West will go beyond the threat of sanctions. It is the idea that even if sanctions are slow, they do eventually work. China is in an entirely different weight class economically than Russia. US and European officials are well aware that the potential implications of sanctions on China is a far more complex exercise than sanctions on Russia, given US and allies' extensive entanglement with the Chinese economy. At least that is according to Nazak Nikakhtar, a former senior US Commerce Department official. China has the world's second largest economy and a massive global supply chain. The war would not only harm them, but the West, which relies on China for countless goods, from shoes to surfboards and cell phones to computers. But if the West is able to target specific corners of China's economy, for example its reliance on foreign-made microchips and telecommunications equipment, it could limit its ability to pursue a long-term military operation. This is what is happening to Russia, who can barely get the specialized parts and resources it needs to maintain its aging arsenal of tanks, missiles, and other weapons. It took close to a year for Western sanctions to show results, but it is happening. It has forced Russian leadership to look to Iran, North Korea, and even China for relief. It certainly makes Chinese leaders wonder if invading Taiwan would be worth the disastrous economic consequences if it were suddenly shut off from Western goods and resources or sell its own wares in foreign markets, the bread and butter upon which it has built itself into a regional superpower. Any invasion is likely to cement sanctions in place for years, and China now has every indication that the West would be willing to sustain these for the long haul, even if it adversely affected their own economies. The invasion of Ukraine was a wake-up call to the US and the rest of NATO. For 30 years, it felt confident that the threat of authoritarianism and conventional peer aggression were relics of the past. A false sense of security lulled the West into believing it could retrench its security commitments and focus inward on themselves. In the years leading up to the war in Ukraine, there were serious, high-level discussions regarding the United States' forward presence in Europe and how far it should go to underwrite European security. It has the most powerful military on Earth. It is the backbone of NATO. If the US had to fight alone, it could certainly defeat any other country in an equal fight. But Putin's invasion reminded American policymakers how valuable multinational security collaboration can be. It highlighted the pitfalls of drawing red lines in the sand and not being willing to back them up. Now, the US and its allies are clearer about how active they will be in supporting their allies and partners. Unfortunately for China, Taiwan is one such place, and it has Putin to thank for the reaffirmation of American political, economic, and military support for the island. Had Putin never invaded, it's fair to assume that the United States may have drifted into ambivalence. With each presidential term, costs of projecting preventative power into the Pacific would continue to mount, causing debate over whether it was all worth it. Who knows, over time the US may have actually withdrawn many of its forces and shuttered its overseas bases, opening a window for China's grey zone operations to come to full effect. Now there's little chance China will get away with this type of behavior without serious repercussions. The US will keep a closer eye on China to ensure it doesn't try to mobilize an invasion force. If it does, it should take heed of one final lesson from Russia. If an invasion goes wrong, you can kiss your power and influence goodbye. Today, almost everyone across the globe, besides Russia itself, knows Putin's military is nowhere near as powerful as he made it out to be. Invading an independent, freedom-loving neighbor is a perfect way to turn the entire world against you. Failed invasions are tickets to infamy. They are permanent marks of discredit, disgrace, and disrepute. Russia has long since lost control of the narrative of benign liberation it touted as its primary aim. NATO has become more united and emboldened, and all from a failed invasion. If China launched its own invasion and failed, it would undoubtedly witness its hard-earned influence and prestige throughout East Asia and even beyond fade away. America's closest regional allies in the Indo-Pacific remain closely tied to China in some form or another. But if China invaded and embarked on a long, drawn-out war, it would see its regional influence shrink relative to its enemies. Just because a country is a major power does not mean the world can't live without it. Just ask Putin. Putin's invasion of Ukraine has been an unmitigated disaster for China. The powerful Eurasian alliance it once hoped to forge with its Russian ally is now severely unbalanced. The world is a completely different place than it was a year ago. Just as the West has wised up to authoritarian threats, China has learned that an invasion would be met with stout Taiwanese resistance and long-term Western support. Power on paper does not guarantee success. But what do you think? Will China decide to invade Taiwan despite the obvious risks? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.
In the summer of 2021, China sparked great alarm in Washington when it tested hypersonic missiles. Some in the United States even feared that this test was another Sputnik moment. General Mark Milley, chairman of the United States Joint Chiefs of Staff, denied that the test was a Sputnik equivalent, but said it was very close to that. How real is this fear? What does the nuclear balance of power between the United States and China look like? If the unthinkable happened, what could a nuclear confrontation between the two look like? Let's begin. China has grown immensely wealthy over the last few decades, especially since it joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, and Beijing has used large portions of its enriched coffers in the drive to create a world-class military capable of competing with the United States. China's naval and air capabilities have increased enormously, but Beijing is now keen to share the love with its nuclear forces as well. China was one of the recognized powers in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which went into effect in 1970. However, it had always had a limited nuclear capability compared to the true nuclear superpowers of the time, the United States and the Soviet Union. It had few ways of delivering nuclear weapons beyond ICBM launchers and silos, and had a small number of active warheads. That has begun to change at a rapid pace in the last couple of years. In 2020, the United States estimated that China had a little more than 200 nuclear warheads. By the end of 2022, however, China had doubled that number. If Beijing continues its nuclear buildup at this pace, it could have about 1,500 nuclear warheads by 2035. However, China is not only building up the number of warheads at its disposal, but the means of delivering them. In 2021, China appeared to be building 200 new nuclear missile silos in its Gansu and Xinjiang provinces. However, China understands that these silos are easy targets, so it's also building more road-mobile ICBMs, new ballistic missile submarines, and new bomber-delivered nuclear weapons. In other words, China is trying to create an effective nuclear triad of its own in a bid to protect its nuclear capability and, if need be, enhance its offensive nuclear potential. China completed the triad with its deployment of the nuclear-capable Zhanhong 6 bomber in 2020. Meanwhile, China conducted 135 ballistic missile tests in 2021, more than every other country in the world combined. The biggest buzz, though, went to its hypersonic test that summer. The July 2021 test featured a hypersonic missile that encircled the world before hitting its target. It flew for a total of 40,000 kilometers, the longest flight of any Chinese land attack weapon on record. At this point, it's always important to clear away some of the cobwebs. Hypersonic missiles, projectiles capable of exceeding Mach 5, are not new. Traditional ICBMs have long exceeded these speeds. What would make China's 2021 weapon new is its combination of a fractional orbital bombardment system, FOBS, with a hypersonic glide vehicle, HGV. A FOBS works by flying into low Earth orbit to an altitude of about 240 kilometers. This allows the device to remain below the line of sight of radar systems designed to pick up the arc of traditional ballistic missiles. Then, before completing a full orbit, the FOBS turns around and performs a retrograde engine burn, slowing its speed so that it will intersect with its designated target. The end result is that a FOBS can strike from an unexpected direction. For example, a missile launched to low orbit over Antarctica can turn around and hit Alaska. The Soviet Union experimented with these systems in the 1970s, but work on FOBS was abandoned after the SALT II treaty banned them, and Soviet submarines became more capable of launching ballistic missiles. China is interested in picking up where the Soviet Union left off, however. Beijing partially sees this as a necessity thanks to greater American investment in missile defense systems following its withdrawal from the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in 2002. The second component of the system, the HGV, makes the FOBs even more unpredictable. Glide vehicles differ from traditional weapons in how they move toward their targets. Traditional ballistic missiles come at a fast but predictable arc. HGVs ride up to orbit, descend, and glide through the atmosphere to reach their targets. An HGV is able to maneuver, roll, or even pull up on re-entry to re-exit the atmosphere and then enter it again. Through these devices, an HGV can alter its trajectory while maintaining hypersonic velocities, making it fast and hard for missile defense systems to predict. China claimed that this test was of a space plane, not a weapons system, but this was a clever response. It exposes the overlap between space vehicles and these types of weapon systems. The hypersonic missile missed its target by about 24 miles. This is of little comfort if such a weapon were to carry a strategic nuclear warhead, however. The test also raised alarms about an intelligence failure, as US officials realized that China's advancement in hypersonic weapons was further along than they once thought. Potentially, China could send this new weapon on a trajectory over the South Pole. The weapon could then turn around and glide towards American targets, because American missile defense systems are focused on trajectories over the North Pole, which is the route that Soviet ballistic missiles would have taken during the Cold War. The new Chinese weapon would leave the United States particularly vulnerable. China's moves are intended to even the playing field in a dangerous game where it had long lagged behind. The United States has the world's second largest nuclear arsenal with 5,224 warheads. The United States currently deploys some of its nuclear weapons to 5 other nations: Turkey, Italy, Belgium, Germany, and the Netherlands. The forward deployment reduces the risk that America's ability for nuclear retaliation will be wiped out in an enemy-first strike. It also gives the United States greater ability to launch nuclear attacks of its own. American nuclear warheads were once deployed to Japan and South Korea but have since been removed. If nuclear tensions were to escalate with China, it's probable the United States would redeploy those weapons there, something the late Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe suggested could be a necessity given the current situation in the region, although he only made this suggestion after his premiership had concluded. The United States is regarded as being behind China and Russia in the deployment of hypersonic technology. There have also been major alarms about the state of America's nuclear triad in the last decade. Most of the weapons and delivery systems are many decades old. For example, the land-based part of the nuclear triad consists of about 400 LGM-30G Minuteman III missiles. This weapon system began development in 1964 and entered service in 1970. It's currently the only land-based ICBM in the United States military, and the Air Force plans to use it into the 2030s. Some of the United States land-based ICBM systems are so old that until 2019 they used 1970s-era floppy disks as part of the command and control system. Other parts of the IT system are as old. While this has the advantage of not being vulnerable to cyber warfare, it also means the system is expensive to maintain, as modern engineers are unfamiliar with it, and the Air Force has increasingly needed to rely on costly civilian specialists to maintain the old architecture. The United States maintains a significant lead over China in the realm of submarine warfare. However, its Ohio-class ballistic missile submarines are also old, with their plans originating in the 1970s, and the first vessels being launched in the early 1980s. Meanwhile, the United States has only 20 active bombers capable of delivering nuclear weapons. Its fleet of B-1 and B-52 bombers were once capable of doing this, but were altered to be conventional only in the 1990s. But these weapons platforms are also old anyway. In recent years, the United States has acknowledged that it allowed its nuclear capability to atrophy following the end of the Cold War. During the Obama administration, the United States made plans to modernize the nuclear triad, which took more concrete shape during the Trump administration. It consisted of a $1.2 trillion plan between 2017 and 2046, including $772 billion for the modernization of strategic nuclear delivery systems, $25 billion for tactical nuclear delivery systems, and $445 billion for facilities needed for the operation of the new nuclear triad. One of the primary weapons in this new arsenal will be the Minuteman III's successor, the LGM-35 Sentinel, which the Air Force plans to have ready by 2030. The Sentinel will come with new silos and a new command and control system. The United States is also working on a replacement for the Ohio-class ballistic missile submarine. This will be the Columbia-class submarine, set to launch in 2031, with 12 of the new vessels planned for construction. So important is this goal that the Navy has identified the Columbia-class submarine as its top priority program, a nod to how vital the US submarine fleet is to deterring China's ambitions. Each Columbia-class submarine will be able to carry up to 16 Trident D5 missiles, each of which can potentially carry 12 Mark IV re-entry vehicles. Although the United States has phased out these multiple re-entry vehicles on its nuclear ballistic missile since 2014 to comply with the New START treaty with Russia, the missiles can be re-equipped with them if the need arises. China is not a member of the New START treaty. Finally, there is the coming B-21 Raider bomber, which is set to replace both the B-1 Lancer and the B-2 Spirit. The Raider was rolled out to photographers for the first time in December 22 and is scheduled to enter service in 2027 with a maiden flight expected in the remaining months of 2023. The Air Force plans to purchase up to 145 B-21s, depending on the plane's engineering and manufacturing development. As the successor of the B-2, the B-21 will be capable of delivering nuclear weapons like the B-61 and B-83 bombs. The United States has also been trying its best to catch up in the hypersonic missile race, and may have closed the gap. In October 2022, the United States launched a test of several hypersonic missile components. These included communications and navigations equipment, and a glide vehicle that can withstand the friction generated by moving at hypersonic velocities. The test was designed to validate aspects of the Navy's conventional prompt strike and the Army's long-range hypersonic weapons program. The Pentagon considered the tests a success. For now, these programs are only experiments, and the Pentagon has still not made a formal decision to acquire hypersonic weapons, according to the Congressional Research Service. Still, the Defense Department spent $4.7 billion on hypersonic weapons research in fiscal year 2023, up from $3.8 billion in fiscal year 2022. Adding these weapons to the United States' traditional nuclear arsenal seems inevitable. How might nuclear war break out? China officially has a no-first-use policy when it comes to nuclear weapons, even if its nuclear forces are attacked by conventional enemy forces. Only in the case of a nuclear weapons strike, officially, would China use its own nukes to retaliate. This policy started with its first nuclear test in 1964, when China declared it will never at any time or under any circumstances be the first to use nuclear weapons. This policy was reaffirmed in a classified Chinese document for the operators of China's nuclear forces, where it put repeat reminders about its no-first-use policy. However, there is skepticism in Washington. The document, called The Science of Second Artillery Operations, has a section concerning what Chinese nuclear forces should do if a strong military power possessing nuclear-armed missiles and an absolute advantage in high-tech conventional weapons is carrying out intense and continuous attacks against our major strategic targets, and we have no good military strategy to resist the enemy. This strong military power is clearly the United States. The document suggests that Chinese nuclear forces should lower the threshold in this scenario and put its nuclear weapons on alert. This is an important distinction, because unlike the United States, China's policy has been to keep its nuclear forces off alert. Its warheads are not mated to its ICBMs, and its nuclear-armed submarines are not on continuous patrol at sea. This suggests that China takes its no-first-use policy seriously. By putting its nuclear forces on alert, China would hope to deter the United States from taking further military action and to not use its nuclear weapons in a potential first strike, which may be tempting as military tensions escalate, given the still small size of China's nuclear arsenal in comparison to that of the United States. However, the document's addition of the notion that China could use nuclear threats to compel the United States to stop a conventional attack made Dr. Gregory Kalaki, the China project manager at the Union of Concerned Scientists, uneasy. The use of nuclear threats to stop a conventional attack can slip into escalation if conventional fighting breaks out. Within the confined and disputed waters of the South China Sea, there are many places where this can happen. It would not necessarily take something as dramatic as a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. An accidental encounter in the South China Sea, such as during one of the United States' Freedom of Navigation operations, FONOPs, could be the trigger to a broader conflict via miscalculation. Close military calls between the United States and Chinese armed forces have happened during these FONOPs before, as China becomes more and more aggressive in asserting its territorial claims in the area, claims that the United States does not recognize. Suppose it's the year 2031. The United States and China are at a standoff over an attempted blockade of the South China Sea's shipping lanes to Taiwan or another American ally in the region. A FONOP leads to a protracted firefight between vessels of the United States Navy and the PLAN. If conventional conflict escalates enough, or if China's leaders consider themselves threatened enough, nuclear readiness of the like Dr. Kalaki suggested could cause further tensions and make one of the two sides believe that the other is going nuclear. For the United States, the threshold for a nuclear strike is lower than one would believe. It does not have a no first-use policy. Authorization to use nuclear weapons can only come from the president. Critics suggest that this should be changed and that further restraints should be placed on the president. But for now, the president can authorize a nuclear strike at any time and for any reason. The only limitation to this authority would be under the laws of armed conflict. For example, if the attack would cause unnecessary humanitarian suffering, or if the attack's target is not a military necessity, the order could be disregarded. However, even in these circumstances, it's likely only that the order would be changed rather than halted. So if the president believes that China will disregard its no first-use policy and resort to nuclear weapons in order to stop a conventional conflict between it and the United States, American nuclear weapons may take to the skies. Once conventional pressures heat up, the impetus to respond and create a nuclear first strike could become acute if the United States believes its missile defense systems will be overwhelmed, or if China believes that it will lose its ability to retaliate thanks to its relatively small nuclear arsenal. Preventing this from happening would require seemingly trustworthy communication between two sides that have already been shooting at each other. How might a nuclear war go? Even with its aging triad, the current nuclear balance of power favors the United States, especially beneath the waves. The United States currently has 14 Ohio-class ballistic missile submarines. Each can carry up to 20 nuclear-armed ballistic or cruise missiles. Some of these are deployed to the contested waters in the Indo-Pacific region. If a nuclear confrontation were to break out with China, the submarines would give the United States its greatest advantage. China is far behind the United States when it comes to underwater warfare. Detecting America's nuclear-powered submarines is a tall order for China's People's Liberation Army Navy. In a nuclear confrontation, America's Ohio-class submarines would swing into action and attack important targets, such as China's Yulin Naval Base on Hainan Island, which houses its fleet of Type 094 Jin-class nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines. In contrast to the Ohio-class, China only has 4 of these submarines, and the United States may hope to take one or more of them off the board by striking the base. Each Type 094 can carry 12 ballistic missiles, with a range between 7,200 and 9,000 kilometers. This would be sufficient to reach the continental United States if launched from the waters near China, but would threaten all of America's bases and allies in the region, plus Alaska and Hawaii. In a nuclear scenario, it's unlikely that all of the Type 094s would be taken out at once. Although they are louder than the Cold War-era Soviet submarines, they would likely be found before they could get into range to attack the continental United States. However, China is also working on a successor ballistic missile submarine, the Type 096, which is quieter and would be armed with new missiles with a range exceeding 9,000 kilometers. The Pentagon expects the Type 096 to be operational by 2030, further adding to China's nuclear readiness. Nuclear missile silos and bases likely to host China's mobile ballistic missile launchers would also be targeted by American submarines. Some of these mobile launchers may have ballistic missiles armed with nuclear-tipped HGVs. Examples would include the medium-range DF-17, with its DF-ZF HGV, which has a range between 1,800 and 2,500 kilometers. This weapon system became operational in 2019, and although it cannot reach the American mainland, it poses a serious threat to the United States bases and fleets in the region. The Ohio-class submarines would be hard for China to remove from the board. Dozens of nuclear ballistic or cruise missiles would come over Chinese airspace in an all-out attack. China has missiles capable of reaching the United States too, and America's interior nuclear bases, naval bases, and silos would come under attack. Air defense systems would destroy some of these, but any that make it through would do devastating damage. And if its hypersonic-related technology comes online, it would have greater success. Additionally, China's leaders have had a long-standing policy of targeting adversarial cities in a nuclear second strike. So even if the United States seeks to avoid civilian areas as much as possible in an attack, China probably won't. It's difficult to tell how exactly a nuclear war between the United States and China would go, except that it would be the most catastrophic confrontation ever recorded. What is clear is that China's nuclear posture is quickly changing from one of minimum deterrence to something far more offensive. The expansion in its nuclear capabilities allows China's military to be bolder in pursuing its expansionist ambitions. Before, America's nuclear superiority made it harder for China to directly challenge the international order led by the United States. That's now beginning to change, and Washington is willing to spend trillions to ensure that its biggest strategic rival does not eclipse its nuclear capability. Describing the current situation as a return to a Cold War-style nuclear arms race may be overdoing it, but one thing is certain: we are closer to that kind of confrontation than at any time since the days of the Soviet Union. What do you think about China's military buildup? How does it change the balance of power with the United States? And what would a nuclear confrontation between them look like? Don't forget to let us know in the comments, and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. The rise of an aggressive China under Xi Jinping has severely disrupted the post-Cold War international order. Xi aims for China to become the world's leading superpower by 2049, the centennial of the Chinese Communist Party's victory over the nationalists in China's civil war. To achieve these goals, China has used its economic leverage to seduce or coerce other nations and multinational corporations to go along with its bidding. It has also expanded its military presence in the South China Sea and increased its saber-rattling against Taiwan, which it aims to incorporate back into the mainland's governance by 2049. China's behavior has caused great alarm among its neighbors in the Indo-Pacific region, prompting the response of a new multilateral coalition, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. But what is this organization, usually called the Quad? Why is it after China? And what are its intentions to counter China's behavior? The Quad had its beginnings in December 2004, in response to the Indian Ocean tsunami. On the 29th, then-President George W. Bush announced that the United States would partner with a regional core group of India, Japan, and Australia to coordinate relief efforts. The effort gave the group its first experience of conducting maritime operations together. The Quad got renewed impetus in the initial rise of Shinzo Abe as the Japanese Prime Minister. When campaigning for office in 2006, Abe described his vision of an arc of freedom and prosperity. The arc would be a grouping of like-minded states in the region making a collective effort to promote liberal values like free markets and the rule of law. In December 2006, then Indian Prime Minister Manmohan Singh announced his country's accession to the dialogue. When 2007 began, then American Vice President Dick Cheney signaled American interest and convinced then Australian Prime Minister John Howard to cooperate as well. Abe traveled to India that April, which paved the way for the Quad's first senior-level meeting the following month. The navies of the four countries then cooperated in the second Exercise Malabar alongside the Singaporean Navy. Despite this promising start, the Quad experienced troubles shortly thereafter. China always viewed it as a threat. At that time, it was not yet apparent that China would attempt to change the international status quo by coercive methods. There were still great hopes that economic liberalization would lead to political liberalization in the country. Important potential partner countries like South Korea were therefore reluctant to join the Quad and risk alienating China. Meanwhile, India, traditionally a non-aligned country, saw public protests over its participation in the Malabar exercise. China's diplomatic efforts helped to lead to the unraveling of the Quad and Shinzo Abe's fall from power in September 2007, depriving it of its leading advocate. By the beginning of 2008, the Quad had collapsed. A decade later, things had changed dramatically. China became more authoritarian at home and confrontational abroad under the leadership of Xi Jinping, who came to power in late 2012. At the same time, Shinzo Abe returned to power in Japan, and just one day after his second premiership began, he signaled his geopolitical intentions. Peace, stability, and freedom of navigation in the Pacific Ocean are inseparable from peace, stability, and freedom of navigation in the Indian Ocean. Japan, as one of the oldest seafaring democracies in Asia, should play a greater role, alongside Australia, India, and the US, in preserving the common good in both regions. This statement was the prototype of the Free and Open Indo-Pacific (FOIP) strategy. Abe's policy was to insert a reinvigorated Japanese military into traditional bilateral and trilateral exercises between the United States, India, and Australia. For example, the United States and India continued to do their traditional bilateral Malabar naval exercises, but Japan became a permanent party to these in 2015. As Abe worked to slowly reconstruct the Quad, China became more confrontational with all of its participating countries. Disputes ratcheted up between Japan and China over the Senkaku Islands, which the former administers but the latter claims as its territory. India and China had numerous border standoffs. Australian politicians were found to have accepted money from China-aligned organizations and individuals, which helped to lead new foreign interference laws in that country in 2018. The rise of Donald Trump to the White House in 2016 also spurred the reformation of the Quad. Trump had long been of the belief that China was the greatest threat to the United States, which made him agreeable to the idea of the Quad. An October 2017 meeting between then Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and Japanese Foreign Minister Taro Kono resulted in them proposing a resumption of the full Quad. The following month at the ASEAN conference in Manila, representatives from the four countries met on the margins to discuss the tense situation in the Indo-Pacific region. All four affirmed their support for the FOIP concept. Quadrilateral meetings on the issue have continued ever since. In the 2000s, after its revival, China has often complained that the Quad is an attempt to create an Asian NATO to contain it. However, the Quad is not a formal alliance, unlike NATO. It's rather an informal grouping of countries. In a statement that laid out the spirit of the Quad, in 2021, the group's leaders said, "We bring diverse perspectives and are united in a shared vision for the free and open Indo-Pacific. We strive for a region that is free, open, inclusive, healthy, anchored by democratic values, and unconstrained by coercion." While not declaring a formal alliance, the statement left little room for doubt that China was the main source of concern among the Quad's members. As such, the Quad is first and foremost a security cooperative, as its proper name suggests. Joint security cooperation has been an integral feature of the Quad since its refounding. Australia was added to the annual Malabar exercises in 2020 and has repeated its presence there since. Quad countries are also increasing their bilateral and trilateral security ties. Japan and India engage in regular JIMEX exercises in the North Arabian Sea, while India and Australia have their bilateral OSINDEX exercise. All Quad countries are participants in the multilateral Rim of Pacific (RIMPAC) exercises. The United States, which is a long-time ally of both Japan and Australia, conducts regular military cross-training with both of those countries. Japan's goals for the Quad are relatively simple: ensure that China does not become the hegemon of Asia. If such a thing were to happen, its trade would be imperiled. Roughly 40% of Japan's imports come through the South China Sea's shipping lanes, and as a resource-poor nation, it needs those imports for its economic survival. Unfortunately for Tokyo, China has increasingly militarized and monopolized the area since 2012. If China is not deterred from further aggression, Beijing will be in a position to dictate the trade of the region, forcing Japan into a terrible geopolitical position. If China gets too powerful, Japan may also lose control of the Senkaku Islands, just as the Philippines lost control of the Scarborough Shoal. The alliance with the United States has traditionally been, and remains, the foundation of Japan's national security. But Australia and India are valuable partners that it cannot do without in light of the higher stakes. Japan has therefore deepened its security ties with Australia. The two countries made a reciprocal forces agreement to formalize procedures for overseas troop deployments. In 2023, Japan announced it will be stationing troops in Australia, which is a deviation from decades of traditional military policy in Tokyo. Japan has also made an acquisition and cross-servicing agreement with India, along with defense equipment, technology, and intelligence sharing agreements. For Australia, the Quad is a reinforcement and leveling up of its traditional diplomatic relationships. For example, Australia has long been a partner in the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance with the United States. Australia's military cooperation with Japan has increased, and in June 2020, then Prime Minister Scott Morrison signaled a mutual logistics sharing agreement with India, while announcing that their bilateral institutions would now be considered as a comprehensive strategic partnership. Moreover, China's recent security pact with the Solomon Islands, which sit to the northeast of Australia, threatens its trade. Australia needs a counterweight, which it sees the Quad as being. The Quad has also allowed Australia to become more militarily capable, as the AUKUS pact with the United States and the United Kingdom will give it nuclear submarines, which Beijing loudly complained about. For India, the Quad represents a departure from its traditional policy of strategic autonomy in foreign affairs. Unlike the other three Quad members, it does not have experience participating in America's system of military alliances. Still, India needs partners, if not allies, to prevent China from getting too powerful. India and China share a disputed border. China's navy has increased its presence in India's backyard. China is also an important partner for India's traditional enemy, Pakistan. China's economic partnerships with India's neighbors through the Belt and Road Initiative and the Comprehensive Economic Partnership threaten to isolate India from the region. In light of this reality, India has had little choice but to increase its ties with the United States. New Delhi has increased its security ties with Washington through military purchases that include anti-submarine platforms and heavy-lift aircraft. India has also signed logistics and base access agreements with Australia and Japan. For the United States, keeping China's power in check and preventing it from becoming a regional hegemon is now the top foreign policy priority. For Washington, the Quad is a valuable institution to assist America in achieving this goal. The United States has global commitments, which Russia's invasion of Ukraine made all too clear. In a direct confrontation between the United States and China, the latter would be able to concentrate all of its resources in the conflict, while America's forces would be divided. Washington has long sought to put a greater emphasis on the Indo-Pacific region, but despite this being a rare area of bipartisan consensus, it's never been able to do so to the extent that it has wanted. NATO's free rider problem and Middle Eastern flare-ups are only two examples of things which divide the attention of the United States and force it to spread its resources more thinly. The Quad therefore is a means for Washington to both put greater emphasis on the strategic region and build up forces and relationships to assist in containing Beijing's ambitions. Through the security cooperation of the Quad, the United States is steadily improving the military readiness of Japan, India, and Australia. The Quad also allows for the rapid cooperation of America's partners to threaten Chinese shipping. For example, India can easily threaten to choke Chinese shipping off from the Strait of Malacca, while Japan can do the same for the Strait of Miyako. As China relies heavily on foreign food and fuel imports, this is an important measure of geostrategic leverage to force China to change its behavior. America's Quad partners are strategically positioned to the east, west, and south of the First Island chain, multiplying the United States' ability to contain China's ambitions in the region. For these reasons, China was again quick to protest the Quad and denounce it as a method of containment, but the cooperating countries have cared far less about Beijing's protests in this second go of the security partnership. China's actions since the first incarnation of the Quad fell apart had alienated its neighbors in the region, as well as the United States. China's response to the COVID-19 pandemic only strengthened the conviction that China was a bad actor on the world stage. 2020 would be an important year in defining the Quad's purpose and giving it staying power. Shortly after the pandemic began, China got into a diplomatic row with Australia over the latter's insistence on an independent inquiry into its origins. China responded to these calls by imposing punitive tariffs on many Australian exports. Meanwhile, the border dispute between China and India saw an armed confrontation in June 2020, which resulted in the deaths of 20 Indian troops and 4 Chinese soldiers. The events of 2021 spurred the Quad to expand its purview. Despite the chaotic presidential election in the United States, Donald Trump's successor, Joe Biden, largely continued his administration's policies regarding China, including with the Quad. However, Biden soon signaled his intentions on expanding the Quad beyond a coalition to contain China. It was the first summit of Joe Biden's presidency, indicating the importance of this multilateral relationship to the new administration's foreign policy agenda. Under Joe Biden, the Quad has evolved beyond a purely military or security partnership. It has also been involved in economic and diplomatic aid. For example, the group's first summit, which took place in March 2021, outlined its plans to counter the COVID-19 pandemic by distributing 1 billion doses of the single-shot Johnson & Johnson vaccine to low- and middle-income countries in Southeast Asia by the end of 2022. The United States would finance the measure, Japan and India would manufacture the vaccines, and Australia would take the lead in distributing the shots and getting them into arms. It was the start of a broader purpose for the Quad, to tackle other global challenges such as cybercrimes, terrorism, and climate change. Although this would seem irrelevant as a strategic counter to China, it's not. China has sought to expand its influence through economic and diplomatic partnerships equally as much as it has attempted to with its military buildup. The Belt and Road Initiative is one of Xi Jinping's most important strategic initiatives, which is why it's not surprising that infrastructure has also been on the Quad's agenda. At the first in-person Quad summit in September 2021, the leaders announced that high-standards infrastructure would be a priority for the partnership. This announcement was an evolution of the trilateral infrastructure partnership already in place between the United States, Japan, and Australia. In May 2022, the Quad leaders announced the Quad Infrastructure Coordination Group, which would focus on transportation, digital connectivity, clean energy, and climate resilience. The statement released by the Biden White House said that the heads of the Quad's respective national development financing agencies had met in Tokyo to discuss the infrastructure financing gap in the region, a veiled shot at the Belt and Road Initiative. The announcement stated that these agencies would cooperate with each other and the private sector to support investments in critical infrastructure. The same White House press release also announced that space and emerging technologies would continue to be a focus for the Quad. The subjects range from 5G supplier diversification to space observation, satellite data sharing, and disaster response and relief for the Indo-Pacific region. In space, the Quad's focus is on observation and data exchanges for the moment, but the release also mentioned a focus on consulting on norms and guidelines. However, with China testing hypersonic glide vehicles, it seems likely that the Quad's security relationship will eventually expand to space. The Quad aims to foster ties between the people of respective member states as well. At their 2021 summit, the leaders announced the Quad Fellowship, which will sponsor 100 students per year, 25 from each country, to pursue STEM graduate degrees at elite universities in the United States, with the cooperation of the private sector. While the dialogue is currently limited to 4 members, there have been discussions about expanding the Quad. Quad Plus meetings have included South Korea, New Zealand, and even Vietnam. South Korea has expressed interest in joining the organization formally, although this has not happened yet. Why? While tensions between the two have lessened since the election of Yoon Suk-yeol to the South Korean presidency in 2022, Seoul and Tokyo have long had frosty relations over historical, economic, and security issues. There is no guarantee that the gradual thawing in relations between South Korea and Japan will continue. Therefore, the Biden administration seems worried that a renewed stress between the two would undermine the Quad's cohesion, should South Korea formally join it. It's also arguable that formally including other countries in the core Quad would undermine the group's cohesion. Too many cooks in the kitchen, so to speak. The current grouping allows rapid communication and decision-making among its members, and all 4 seem to want to keep it that way. On the other hand, the Quad cannot afford to remain too insular. Other like-minded countries, including countries in Europe, are expanding their Indo-Pacific strategies and their presence in the area. If the 4 Quad members do not engage in meaningful coordination with these efforts, they risk duplicating or undercutting each other's efforts in the region, according to a report written by Garima Mohan and Christy Govella for the German Marshall Fund, a security and democracy-focused think tank headquartered in Washington. Furthermore, to build a positive alternative to China's vision for the Indo-Pacific region that goes beyond the security sphere, the Quad will need to develop a reputation of delivering on its many pledges. Unfortunately for the Quad, there are already reasons to believe that it will not be able to do so. By May 2022, it was clear that the vaccine partnership had underperformed the lofty goals set for it. Delivery of the shots only began in early 2022, when the pandemic was already winding down. By May, the Quad had delivered less than half the vaccine doses it promised thanks to time, circumstances such as India's COVID-19 outbreak in the spring of 2021, and controversy over the selected Johnson & Johnson vaccine. By September 22, it became clear that the goal would not be met, and the Quad pivoted away from the vaccine pledge. Instead, the Quad's policy would shift to preparing for future emergencies, such as strengthening global healthcare architecture and prevention of future pandemics. The Quad has not always been smooth sailing in other ways too. The 4 members have been at odds at times. Unlike the other 3 Quad members, India has been far more ambiguous in its response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's purchased Russian energy at an increased rate, helping to keep Moscow's economy afloat. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi has also come under international controversy for his government's crackdown on the country's Muslim population in the Indian-controlled portion of the disputed Kashmir region. As the Quad pledges to be a bulwark of liberal values, some of Modi's policies may undermine its humanitarian image. However, these controversies have tended to take secondary status in the Quad, which remains a security-first grouping. In international relations, security considerations will always take priority over economic and ideological considerations. And with the Quad now being broadly popular among the electorates of all 4 member states, It's an institution with staying power, unlike the way it was the first time round. For all 4 members of the Quad, the security considerations are clear. China under Xi Jinping has inserted itself at the center of many of the world's critical supply chains, built up its armed forces, saber-rattled against its neighbors, expanded its influence over other nations with its Belt and Road infrastructure projects, and become more authoritarian. Preventing China from becoming strong enough to dictate terms in the region is a matter of survival for India, Australia, and Japan, and necessary if the United States wishes to remain the world's leading nation. The Quad may not be an Asian NATO, but its arrival has made many experts conclude that there is a new Cold War going on in the Indo-Pacific region. As NATO proved so important in containing the Soviet Union in the first Cold War, the Quad's advocates seek for it to do the same to China now. But what do you think about the Quad? What will its future be? And how will it shape the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific region? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also remember to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. If you go ahead and spin the proverbial wheel of global worry today, there's a good chance you'll land on the words China and World War III. Unfortunately, there are several reasons for that, and they all lead to the question no one wants to think about. Is China getting ready for World War III? It's true that nowadays you can't go far without someone talking about the perils of Taiwanese reunification, artificial Chinese islands, Cold War 2.0, or the specifications of the latest hypersonic missile. Add to that the increasing frequency of Chinese incursions into Taiwanese airspace, Japan's recent decision to purchase hundreds of new weapons for its own defense, like these American-made Tomahawk missiles, and closer military cooperation between the US and Australia, and we are starting to see the signs of another global conflict on the horizon, one that is likely to begin somewhere in the Indo-Pacific. It all adds up to another doomsday scenario waiting in the wings, and some believe it could take place as early as 2024. Does China have a World War III plan in place, and if so, what does it look like? China's rise over the past few decades seems to indicate that the worrisome and likely answer to the first question is yes, and here's why. Tensions between China and the West have not been this high in a long time. Rewind several decades, and many experts would have laughed at you if you claimed you were a time traveler from the future and China posed a serious geopolitical threat to the international order. That's because the 1990s were a strange time, and not just because of the oversized jeans and kids' obsession with green slime. It was a period of untempered Western optimism. Yep, you heard that right, optimism. From our pessimism-soaked vantage point today, the geopolitical arc of that decade was almost unicorn-like, a surreal period of national unity, hope, and security, with the 9/11 terrorist attacks on the Twin Towers. But for a while, things seemed, well, good. Emerging victorious from its 45-year ideological standoff with the Soviet Union, for a brief unipolar moment in time, the United States enjoyed unmatched power and prestige on the global stage. There were no more near-peer threats. While terrorists and revolutionaries conspired at the peripheries of power, America's military and its coalition partners, equipped to the eyeballs with the latest technology and fresh off their rollicking victory in the Persian Gulf, bought into the idea that democracy was spreading and would continue to do so with assistance and persistence around the globe. It was in this geopolitical climate that things really started to change for China, not that many Western observers really noticed. Between 1949 and 1971, it had existed behind the Bamboo Curtain, a totalitarian dictatorship under the authoritarian communist revolutionary Mao Zedong. Things changed when the United States sought rapprochement with China in the 1970s, thereafter reopening diplomatic relations and turning China into a willing Cold War partner through strengthening economic relationships and a degree of exposure to the West it had not enjoyed since World War II. China started modernizing a lot. Americans profited, China grew. As China grew, Americans hoped the exposure to Western values and ideas would liberalize and democratize China. There were social and cultural reforms amid the modernization, yes, but not many. China's benign growth lulled the West into a false sense of security. Some pundits argue that it was in the 1990s, the heyday of American optimism, that China started really playing the long game, hatching a secret 50-year plan to achieve the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation after a century of downturns. Entangling its economy with the United States, it grew fast enough to convince the West it deserved a place in the World Trade Organization, the WTO, something it achieved by the early 2000s. Yes, we will play by the rules of international order, Chinese leaders proclaimed, with enough zeal to make their Western partners proud. It was around then its economy started booming, growing almost 10% every year for the next 2 decades. Between 1980 and 2000, its GDP quadrupled. Starting at under $90 billion in 1980, it now hovers around $13 trillion, the fastest growing increase in human history.
Hundreds of millions of Chinese residents were lifted out of poverty as the country's economic potential skyrocketed. As globalization continued and China received hundreds of billions of dollars of global investment, it established a trade footprint to rival much of the rest of the world, providing cheap labor that built most of the products now adorning your home while becoming competitive in cutting-edge cyber, space, and technology sectors. It has long since become East Asia's economic titan par excellence. It thrived under the auspices of global capitalism. It took on some of the trappings of the West, especially in its business and trade practices, but it never really democratized. To this day, it maintains its communist, centralized authoritarian regime under the singular vision of its latest ruler, Xi Jinping. And Xi has a vision, all right. Having covertly flourished under the umbrella of American power for several decades, China is now preparing the next phase of its grand strategy to catapult itself into the realm of peerless global hegemon, one that can impose itself in its Indo-Pacific neighborhood at will while projecting enough global influence to shape the rules-based international order in its own image. It's taken them 14 five-year plans to get to that point, but they've finally arrived. Now China wants to build a community of common destiny, essentially a nice way of saying it wants to coercively achieve what it views the US doing all over the world, leading international organizations, becoming a political and economic model for developing countries, being able to project world-class military power all across the globe, all while leveraging its trade relationships, allies, and partners to achieve its interests, aka replace the United States as the world's leading state. They chose 2049 for the date to achieve all of this, the centenary of the founding of the People's Republic of China, PRC, but each successive milestone for modernization has amped up the tension between China and the West. National security insiders have been sounding alarm bells for a decade now, but only recently have things started to get real. Over the past 3 decades, China has spent its way to military might. In 2019, it was spending more than South Korea, Japan, India, Russia, and Taiwan combined, accounting for over half of Asian GDP and half of all Asian military expenditures. China didn't have to just outspend their competition, however. Over the past decade, a growing number of Western defense officials have started kicking themselves for not realizing the pitfalls of economic interdependence with China. It's been no secret that for decades, Chinese spies have been stealing valuable intellectual property, including US military secrets. Just look at their latest stealth fighter, the J-20. It's a surreal mashup of the latest stealth technology, the type you might get if an American F-22, F-35, and a Russian MiG-144 walked into a bar, had one too many, and started spilling their secrets within earshot of a Chinese spy. China has stolen immense amounts of data too. Some we unwittingly give them by opting in to use Chinese-owned platforms like TikTok, data that US officials claim gives them enough personal information to identify potential targets for intelligence collection and other subterfuge. Just like the West can and probably does, China uses this data to geolocate top national security targets, recruit spies, conduct massive remote cyber attacks, and steal military and technology secrets. The issue isn't just that China has shiny new advanced submarines, missiles, aircrafts, drones, and other toys to play with. It is that it's now looking like it has the logistics, infrastructure, and know-how to use them effectively, and that's something we need to explore further. As we all know, nation-states can't just fling military power around the globe willy-nilly. You have to have the national industrial base to build up your power, the domestic support to use it, the transport infrastructure to move it, agreements in place to base it, and an effective doctrine and strategy to employ it. It took the United States 4 years of total war and victory in 2 theaters to emerge as a bona fide global superpower after World War II. Were it not for the destabilization in the aftermath of that war and the exigencies of the Cold War that followed it, it would not have many of the military basing agreements or the alliances and partnerships it now enjoys around the world today. Many of those relationships and the infrastructure sustaining them took decades, even generations, to build, and today that is something we often take for granted. But not China. They know the price of obscurity and the difficulty of restoring national power and prestige back to superpower levels. Their long-term strategy, in part, is to achieve the same degree of global agency that the United States enjoys. It too wants bases for its military all over the world, flourishing economic relationships, and safe trade routes for its commercial fleet. Without a world war to create the conditions for its rise to power, China has had to engineer its rise artificially, partially through guile and subterfuge, partially using state-sponsored initiatives that scream, "We are trying to go global, and we will make it happen whether you like it or not." One of China's global projects that stands out from the rest in terms of ambition, scale, and significance, the One Belt Road Initiative, or Belt and Road Initiative, Initiative (BRI). Much like the ancient Silk Road that connected Chinese traders and goods with rich foreign markets, the BRI strives to achieve the same degree of global influence for China in the modern era. To understand China, you have to grapple with the BRI. Many analysts view the project as China's answer to the Marshall Plan, a post-World War II economic assistance package that sought to revitalize war-torn Europe. Unlike the Marshall Plan, the BRI is extended to any willing economic partner. Formal agreements between China, the host nation, to build economic and political ties generally precede a litany of Chinese investment, funding, infrastructure projects, tech collaboration, and more. In the process, China gets access to ports and airfields, markets for state-owned companies, safeguards for international trade, and international influence. For years, the BRI has been the litmus test for global Chinese power projection. The belt connects China with Europe and the other dozen nations on its borders via a series of overland trade routes, while the road refers to its maritime interests, fueling stations, ports, industry, infrastructure scattered throughout Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean. A great example of periphery diplomacy, BRI projects can now be found from the Himalayas to the Horn of Africa and Mediterranean basin. It has funded infrastructure deals in Malaysia, gas pipelines and railroads in Nigeria, Egypt, Ethiopia and Kenya, maintains port operations in Greece, projects in Sri Lanka, and has other projects in the works. The West has viewed the BRI warily. Some criticize China's debt trap diplomacy, a tactic of luring economically vulnerable states into taking out Chinese loans and then jacking up the rates to unpayable levels as a form of coercion over the government in question. Others fear China's growing telecommunications and economic influence over Europe and the global South, but there still hasn't been a really unified response, and China continues to shovel money into its initiative, with another $124 billion pledged in 2017. One of the big warning signs came that same year, when China decided to establish a hub in Djibouti, a developing nation strategically located in the Gulf of Aden on the Horn of Africa. China had essentially said it would never open an official military base there, and then they did, calling it a logistics facility, even though PLA Navy Marines and other forces regularly mull about with armored vehicles and artillery. It is considering similar projects in Cambodia, Myanmar, Thailand, Singapore, Indonesia, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, United Arab Emirates, Kenya, Seychelles, Tanzania, Angola, and Tajikistan, evidence of China's expanding military footprint around the globe. These military bases hold great potential for regional destabilization. Such developments are a warning that countries can become unwitting partners to PRC military expansion by giving China access to airfields and ports it would otherwise lack. A global footprint, therefore, is a prerequisite for China's national rejuvenation and has certainly empowered its actions at home. Maritime disputes in the waters around China are so common they've almost become normalized. These waters in the South China Sea are heavily trafficked, including some of the richest shipping lanes in the world. Xi Jinping made a promise not to militarize certain islands China artificially built in the South China Sea. Now the Parcel and Spratly Islands are militarized and can be used to intimidate and coerce coastal states throughout the region. The bullying continues in the East China Sea as Chinese merchant vessels regularly dominate lucrative shipping lanes. Coast Guard, military, and commercial ships deprive foreign fishermen of access to resources, and policymakers make ambitious maritime claims that are frequently rejected as lacking basis in international law. For the record, territorial waters are considered up to 12 nautical miles off a country's coastline, a fact China ignores. China wants to monopolize the natural gas, oil, and hydrocarbon reserves it feels it has a claim to, even hundreds of miles away. A lot of the tension arises near the Senkaku Islands, a group of uninhabited islands that in 1971 reverted back to Japanese administrative control under the Okinawa Reversion Agreement. Over these seas, China has set out to create air defense identification zones, increasing its operational reach even further. Taken together, China's economic and cultural influence combined with its renewed military strength add up into a scary equation for Beijing's neighbors. There have also been regular border conflicts on the China-India frontier since a PRC-instigated clash in 2020 left dozens dead. India claims China has the onus to withdraw. They haven't. South Korea is worried about North Korea, China's only major Asian ally, doing something stupid. Even Japan, those guys who were so committed to pacifism after World War II that they called their military a self-defense force, are now so alarmed they're arming themselves with hundreds of Tomahawk missiles, writing counter-strike capabilities into their fighting doctrine, and conducting joint military exercises with American and Australian forces, an image that surely would have made our grandparents both proud and perplexed. And nobody should be more scared than Taiwan. Taiwan. The small independent island nation will almost undoubtedly be ground zero in any World War III scenario with China. Here's why. China is bent on reuniting Taiwan with mainland China. The spat goes back to World War II, when nationalist rebels fled to the island and created a vibrant democratic society, one China refuses to acknowledge or respect. Ever since, China has wanted Taiwan back more than a prepubescent teen who accidentally traded their holographic first edition Charizard for a bag of potato chips. And this is a problem, since the United States has all but formally pledged to intervene and protect Taiwan in the event China decides to invade. And boy, has it probably thought about it. In August 2022, the China State Council produced a white paper whose table of contents made China's position on the issue explicitly clear. Chapter 1. Taiwan is part of China. This is an indisputable fact. Chapter 2. Resolute efforts of the CCP to realize China's complete reunification. Chapter 3. China's complete reunification is a process that cannot be halted. Chapter 4. National reunification in a new era. Chapter 5. Bright prospects for a peaceful reunification. It's okay, you can tell us how you really feel, Beijing. We are one China, the paper alleges, and Taiwan is part of China. This is an indisputable fact supported by history and the law. Taiwan has never been a state. Its status as part of China is unalterable. The CPC is committed to the historic mission of resolving the Taiwan question and realizing China's complete reunification. So China is overwhelmingly focused on reunifying Taiwan. They say they won't use force. Where have we heard that before? Authoritarian leader claims he won't use force to reunify territory he believes is rightfully his. But hey, this type of tension has been brewing since the 1996 Taiwan Strait crisis, when the PRC had a showdown with an American carrier group after conducting a bunch of missile tests in the Taiwan Strait. The outcome of the Taiwan issue has real global bearings. Taiwan is the epicenter of the global semiconductor industry. What's a semiconductor, you say? Anything that has an electronic chip. Your phone, your computer, your wireless modem, your electronic toys, your average ballistic missile, medical instruments, televisions, cutting-edge satellites, they all rely on semiconductors for computing. It is a $556 billion industry, one that for better or for worse hinges on the whims of a Taiwan-China-US love triangle. You see, the US sells 46% of global semiconductors, but only manufactures 12% of them. China consumes the most, importing $378 billion worth and putting what it buys into 35% of the world's devices. And Taiwan, as you might expect, has 53% of the global semiconductor market share and produces 90% of the world's most advanced ones you might see in cars, smartphones, and military tech. That's a serious share of the market. Interdependence is a problem. The US is now trying to decouple itself from the Taipei-Beijing chip drama and become self-sufficient. But Taiwan's predominance on the global chip market is one reason Beijing literally cannot afford to let Taiwan continue to independently exist. It needs to set the terms of trade in the region, not Taiwan and other Western-facing nations. Otherwise, it will always be seen as a second-rate power. What does this all amount to? Well, this situation has produced the worst security crisis in the Taiwan Strait in 20 years. China means business. As Taiwan becomes more eager to carve out its independence from the mainland, China views its very sovereign existence as an existential threat. China worries about being hamstrung behind the first island chain, a series of nations that includes the Philippines, Borneo, Japan, and the Ryukyu Islands, that it fears can contain and limit its ability to project power beyond its shores. Taiwan is at the heart of this island chain, a cornerstone of Western power in the region, one that perpetually transmits dangerously subversive messages of Western-backed prosperity while it remains independent. With Taiwan under America's orbit, it is a thorn in Xi's side. With a reunified Taiwan, China gains the ability to break the first island chain and wield influence deep into the Pacific. Predictably, China is throwing caution to the wind regarding Taiwan's territorial sovereignty, violating Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone, ADIZ, and the median line dividing the Taiwan Strait, once considered as an invisible barrier between the two entities with frightful regularity. Between 1954 and 2020, there were only 4 Chinese violations of these internationally recognized demarcations. In 2020 alone, there were 380. There were more than double that number the following year with 969 incursions. The biggest came on October 4th, 2021, a day that saw 56 aircraft enter Taiwan's air defense zone, unironically coinciding with China's National Day of celebration. By May of this year, there had been a 50% increase in the number of incursions over the same span in 2021. Partially to send a supportive signal in response, the US conducted a series of high-profile political visits to the island. China didn't buy it. To them, the visits were needlessly escalatory. They responded with with more overflights, setting a new record for monthly sorties. Since the summer, the PLA Air Force, PLAF, has flown over 1,000 sorties near Taiwan, 40% of them in the ADIZ or over the median line. Today, it is coming into Taiwanese airspace on a near-daily basis, ramping up its intimidation efforts around Taiwan in other ways too, from anti-submarine warfare, drone reconnaissance, and cyber attacks to the growth of its naval and missile presence in the region. China's end goal is clear. Taiwan has voiced alarm and concern over the near-constant encirclement drills, labeling them as escalatory, equivalent of a sea and air blockade of the island. If these are, in fact, dress rehearsals for a full-scale invasion, China will continue to ramp up the pressure as the time goes on. The on-ramp to war, then, is there, and it's volatile. Some pundits compare the existing slate of geopolitical relationships in the Indo-Pacific to the entangled alliance systems in Europe on the eve of World War I. This is, at least, a line of reasoning. Hal Brands, a prominent political scientist at Johns Hopkins University, has espoused comparing Japanese, Australian, and American collaboration as a latter-day triple entente, the pre-World War coalition that sought to contain Imperial Germany in the Western Pacific. It didn't take much for the World War I powder keg to erupt in the Balkans, fueling a chain reaction that resulted in the First World War. If history is any guide, it won't take much to escalate a regional clash in the Indo-Pacific into a global war either. It is here in Asia's maritime heartland where all the ingredients of a global cataclysm are conspiring against the post-Cold War period of peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific. One analyst observed, it's also here where the naked edge of China's hegemonic ambitions are on full display, with dire consequences for smaller neighbors and the broader liberal international order. Here lies the defining geopolitical dilemma of our times. Well put. So how are the major players gearing up to play their part? We've already talked about China, at least their geopolitical maneuvering. Militarily, they've been following the same path, modernizing at an impressive rate to add bite to their bark as they pursue their strategy of recasting the global governance system in its own image. Its to-do list has, so far, taken a page right out of America's playbook. China has adopted the model that made America powerful, first building a moderately prosperous society in all respects, then using that as a foundation to build a truly competitive, world-class military. The fusion of civil-military power is deliberate. Industrial developments in quantum computing, AI, robotics, and biotechnology not only help China become competitive in the civilian sphere, these technologies can be appropriated to help the Chinese network their military forces. And make no mistake, this is something it is eagerly doing. To create a state-of-the-art air force, it has set a goal to fully network its combined and joint chains of command by 2027. Advancing dual-use technologies, ones that can benefit civilian and military infrastructure alike, will enable rapid information exchange between its army, navy, air, rocket, and yes, even space forces, easily setting the Chinese military apart from anything America's nearest peer, the Russians, have been able to achieve in Ukraine if they succeed. For a while now, the CCP has portrayed a West in relative decline. This narrative fuels Beijing's hopes it can supplant the United States as the preeminent global superpower. And to be fair, things in the United States haven't been all that peachy over the past decade or so. Race riots, populism, rampant misinformation and fake news, capital uprisings, COVID, political polarization, mistrust, and fear have exposed internal fractures and brought American democracy to its weakest point in generations. But America has been gearing up for its marathon clash against China for years now, in the hopes that if things did spill over into a full-scale war, it would be ready. American leaders, regardless of political party, are now mostly unified on this. They know the coming struggle will be ideological and cultural as much as it will be an in-and-out technological, economic, and military competition. Still, it wasn't really until 2018 that the United States officially changed its strategic posture to address China's rise. At the tail end of two fruitless decades in the Middle East, its national strategy shifted to recognize China, not terrorists or Russia, as the main peer adversary. This year, the Biden administration updated its national security strategy but did not depart from the rhetoric or strategic competition that pervaded earlier iterations. American strategy emphasizes this as the decisive decade, to get ahead and win the competition for the 21st century. Some people criticize American strategy for reviving antiquated Cold War mentalities, painting over Soviet tropes with Chinese skins in another zero-sum adversarial competition that could needlessly escalate into war. Vastly different political systems aside, there are more similarities than differences between China and the United States than there were between the US and the Soviet Union, especially in the realm of economics. The two competing powers are not mutually exclusive, but disagreements and mistrust are common enough destabilizers that many fear the status quo can't be maintained for long. China is aware that it still cannot compete with the United States in many areas. The United States Navy, for instance, though technically smaller than the Chinese Navy, continues to patrol strategic waterways in the Indo-Pacific, ensuring vital sea lanes
lanes remain open for free and flourishing international trade. American carrier groups have bases throughout the first island chain. American submarines and aircraft tend to be more robust, possessing longer range and better stealth technology than their Chinese counterparts. Chinese jet engines are not as advanced as American ones. Its military suffers quality control issues with its imbalanced admixture of antiquated and modern military systems and vehicles. Its logistics and transport capabilities lag far behind their globe-trotting American adversary. And above all, the Chinese lack concrete fighting experience, having fought and lost their last major operation in Vietnam in 1979. Experience the United States coming off its own unfortunate Middle Eastern odyssey nevertheless has in spades. But the PLA's military strategy is catered to overcome these shortcomings. In a World War III scenario, especially one involving Taiwan, the United States, its allies and partners, namely Japan, South Korea, Singapore, the Philippines, and possibly India, would have to operate in China's neck of the woods at the tail end of an incredibly long logistics network. The United States' geographic location makes it reliant on small overseas bases, refueling tankers, transport vehicles, and carriers to convey and sustain its units abroad. While China continues modernizing its forces and develops its own expeditionary capabilities, it has developed an anti-access area denial (A2AD) strategy to keep America and its allies at bay in the Indo-Pacific. The strategy has seen China prioritize the construction of a bristling array of ground-based missiles, naval assets, and aircraft equipped with the latest air-to-air and air-to-ground missiles that can outrange their American counterparts, and thus discourage them from intervening in a regional conflict. This active defense strategy will make American intervention in Taiwan both risky and potentially deadly. Is all of this really leading to a future world war? Most security experts will be the first to tell you that the war against China is anything but inevitable. If both powers can learn to manage their competitive relationship, they can peacefully coexist despite their adversarial posture. But wars can ignite from inauspicious sources. As Peter Warren Singer, a strategist and senior fellow at a think tank called New America and award-winning author, has written, in the coming decades, a war might ignite accidentally, such as by two opposing warships trading paint near a reef not even marked on a nautical chart, or it could slow burn and erupt as a reordering of the global system in the late 2020s, a period at which China's military buildup is on pace to match the US. Singer has spent a lot of time thinking about the type of war we might expect in the Pacific. The war, he argues, will be a multi-domain conflict, meaning it will transpire in the traditional domains of air, sea, and land, as well as futuristic domains like space, the lifeblood of modern military communications, and cyber, where digital military systems and civilian infrastructure may be prone to attack. The United States has not waged a multi-domain war against a peer adversary since 1945, and so many of the lessons it learned in Iraq and Afghanistan may not be as relevant to a war with China. Likewise, America's traditional approach to wars has been to overmatch its enemies, relying on military technology at least one generation ahead to produce qualitative advantages on the battlefield. US forces can't count on overmatch in the future, Singer argues, since much of America's intellectual property has been stolen outright by Chinese spies, while its R&D has been accelerating its experimentation with space, drone, hypersonic, and cyber technologies. Still, experimentation is not the same as full-scale acquisition and implementation. China's two biggest vulnerabilities are historically significant, that it is reliant on imported semiconductors and microchips, things it cannot produce itself, and second, that it is heavily reliant on imported oil. The situation is not unlike Japan's in the early 20th century, a rapidly modernizing imperial power with a plucky navy totally reliant on oil imports to sustain itself. As it started to expand into China and the Pacific, seeking access to raw resources, the United States embarked the export of oil and other military goods. Pearl Harbor, the start of the last war for the United States fought in the Pacific, came in part because Japanese leaders viewed the war with the United States as inevitable. It needed an independent oil supply, something it would seek in the oil-rich Dutch East Indies, and it knew if it attacked, the US would come knocking, so it needed to prevent its own geopolitical encirclement by striking a knockout blow on the American fleet, then stationed at Pearl Harbor. It had a narrow window, given its limited oil reserves at home, and so they attacked. Some say another Pearl Harbor is brewing, this time with Taiwan at the epicenter. Reunifying the island by force will give China access to the semiconductors it needs, but it would have to ensure that the United States could not meaningfully intervene. Toshi Yoshihara, a China expert who works at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessment, has warned that the PLA's views on a Pacific conflict are consistent with Pearl Harbor, and that they are predisposed to delivering a decisive first blow against US deployed forces in the Western Pacific, particularly those in Japan.
Chinese doctrine indeed emphasizes surprise at the outset of war, all part of a counter-intervention strategy to keep the Beijing, Tianjin, Shanghai, Nanjing, Guangzhou, Shenzhen corridor open. Its precision strike arsenal, primarily made up of DF-21C missiles, are capable of hitting any target on the entire Japanese archipelago, while its DF-26 missiles can fire conventional and nuclear warheads almost 4,000 kilometers, far enough to strike the strategic US base at Guam. In all likelihood, if it were to spring an amphibious invasion of Taiwan, China's tactic would be to saturate America's roving carrier groups and their escorts with waves of ballistic anti-ship missiles, overcome their defenses, and send billions of dollars of valuable equipment to the bottom of the ocean before it can be brought to bear. This would help overcome the early gulf in military shipping, aircraft, and tonnage between the two sides. They would then target vulnerable American sensor aircraft, refueling tankers, and cargo ships to curtail America's ability to get close to Chinese territory. The United States has far more battle force missiles than the Chinese, meaning the total number of missiles capable of being fired in combat before resupply, but the Chinese do have enough to saturate and destroy 3 American carrier groups simultaneously, potentially turning the American naval forces in the Pacific into a moot point before a war begins. There is even evidence that they have been practicing such preemptive strikes in the Gobi Desert in western China. Such a move might be good in the short term, but short-term tactical victories do not win wars. China would then have to contend with the galvanization of American morale, the mobilization of its entire economy for war, and the possibility of intervention from many of its regional and global partners, one of whom is Japan, the world's 3rd largest economy with a powerful navy of its own. If China went to war, it would be anything but subtle. For an operation that big in the 21st century, it's almost impossible to achieve the element of surprise. Observers would see a flurry of activity in China's eastern and southern theater commands opposite Taiwan for weeks and even months prior to invasion. Ports of embarkation, airfields, field hospitals, and mobile command posts buzzing, units deploying with oil and gas pipelines, transport ships loading, commercial ships looking to provoke and escalate. The forces far from Taiwan would be placed on high alert. National mobilization efforts would increase, and the military would begin commandeering civilian vessels, ferries, aircrafts, trucks, and trains. China would have to surge its production of ballistic long-range missiles and cruise missiles for a massive anti-air, anti-ship, air-to-air, and beach bombardment. It would need to achieve a degree of economic self-sufficiency in anticipation for the sanctions that would undoubtedly be implemented. It would be a lot like what we saw in Ukraine with Russian forces massing on the border, not unlike a classic game of Risk. You mass on your enemy's border, you claim you come in peace, you are only there to defend yourself, you claim. Meanwhile, battle plans are circulating, and you are one move away from starting World War III. What's next? Unlike the Japanese at Pearl Harbor, who failed to authorize a 3rd strike to neutralize the American carrier and submarine fleet, the Chinese would have to find a way to continually pressure the Americans in the Pacific to deter further intervention. Making it so prohibitively costly, its morale and will to assist Taiwan would crumble. An invasion of Taiwan would be tantamount to Germany's invasion of the Rhineland in 1936. Unless the West is willing to stand up and deter Chinese aggression from the start, an invasion could spark emergency rearmament programs, mass mobilization, and quickly escalate into a global war. Xi and the CCP are no fools, however. They know it would be a Rubicon moment if they were to invade Taiwan, something they could never walk back from. They will have been watching Putin's adventure in Ukraine with great interest, observing firsthand how aggressive regional land grabs can spiral into an out-and-out, no-holds-barred contest against deceptively capable nations with Western backing. They know if they act, they will immediately forfeit their national image abroad and become international pariahs. In the end, China will have to figure out what ultimate victory would look like, and if it will be worth the price of an all-out war. The ball is already in their court. Reunifying Taiwan by force is a massive obstacle. Overturning an entire global order is even harder by an order of magnitude. Could China do it? Is war really inevitable? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.
Why and in what way are the Philippines important to US Pacific strategy? In the 1990s and 2000s, the United States could afford to bask in its victory over the Soviet Union, as no other state in the international system was capable of challenging its global preeminence. That rapidly changed in the 2010s, as the economic and military rise of China upended American foreign policy. For the first time since the Cold War, the United States faced a near-peer competitor in a region of the world, the Indo-Pacific, which had become the engine of the global economy. America's costly Middle Eastern adventures in the War on Terror had contributed to a lack of full readiness to meet the new challenge, and national security experts in Washington had warned that slowly but surely, the United States was losing its traditional military advantage in the region, as China rapidly began to modernize its armed forces and concentrate hard power in the seas and skies of the First Island chain. were the world's most strategic trade routes transited. The pivot to Asia strategy of the Obama administration signaled that the United States now had a new top foreign policy priority: contain China's ambitions and prevent it from becoming a regional superpower in the Indo-Pacific. The Trump and Biden administrations both continued and expanded this policy, making it a rare area of bipartisan consensus in the increasingly polarized world of American politics. Unsurprisingly, as part of this containment policy, all three administrations have heavily courted the Philippines. In this video, we will look at the relationship between the two countries and at just how important the Philippines is to American geopolitical strategy in the Indo-Pacific region. The United States and the Philippines have a deep relationship that goes back to 1898, when it became an American colony after the Spanish-American War. After the brutal Philippine-American War and Moro Rebellion, the colony was peaceful for a time, until it saw some of the worst fighting in World War II. The Philippines achieved its full independence from the United States in 1946, but America retained military bases there until 1992, when the Navy handed over its base on Subic Bay to the Filipino government. The closing of the base seemed to mark a turning point not only for the Filipino-American relationship, but for the region, as it was the last US military outpost in Southeast Asia. With the Cold War over and the United States the world's undisputed hegemon, there seemed to be no need for such a presence. However, the Mutual Defense Treaty, MDT, between the United States and the Philippines, which came into force in 1951, remained on the books. The MDT would play a critical role in America's return to its former colonial possession. The rise of China changed the equation in the region, and in 2012, the new reality affected the Philippines in a dramatic way. In that year, China seized control of the Scarborough Shoal, an atoll with valuable fisheries and hydrocarbon reserves that rests within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone, as per the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas, UNCLOS. However, China ignored UNCLOS and claimed that the shoal was its territory based on its infamous 9-line map, which it uses to assert ownership of 90% of the South China Sea. By the summer, Chinese Coast Guard and fishing vessels had excluded Filipino ships from the Scarborough Shoal, walling off its lagoon. China has effectively controlled the territory ever since, but the dispute over the Scarborough Shoal continues to this day, despite the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague ruling against China in 2016. On December 10, 2023, Chinese Coast Guard and maritime militia vessels used water cannons to disrupt the resupply of Filipino fishermen by civilian ships off the Scarborough Shoal. Other Filipino ships were rammed, and one of them suffered engine damage. The incident was the latest display of Filipino vulnerability to Chinese territorial expansion in these critical waterways. Shortly after seizing the Scarborough Shoal, China ramped up its drive for territory in the South China Sea. It took the Spratly Islands, which lie close to the Philippines, and eventually fortified them with artificial islands that host military infrastructure such as radar stations, missile silos, anti-aircraft and anti-ship weapons, and even in some cases airfields. With China's military presence in the region growing and the Filipino military in no condition to dispute Beijing's moves, there was little choice but for the Philippines to renew its military alliance with the United States. The first step in the process came in 2014 with the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, EDCA. The EDCA brought American troops back to the Philippines for the first time in over 20 years. Under this agreement, the Philippines granted new bases for the United States Armed Forces to operate on its territory, although it retained ownership of the sites. Additionally, the terms of the EDCA state that the United States must cover the cost of the bases, although it does not need to pay rent. The Philippines not charging such rent demonstrated how important a renewed American military presence in the area became for Manila. Initially, 5 locations were agreed to host American forces. One of them was Fort Magsaysay in Nueva Ecija. The others were unsurprisingly concentrated further south, toward the disputed waters of the South China Sea. One of the new bases, Antonio Batista Air Base, was very close to the contested Spratly Islands, giving the United States the ability to rapidly project power to counter China's military buildup in the area. The southern dominant locations of the first 4 EDCA bases signaled Manila's priorities for the new partnership. It needed assistance in the South China Sea dispute and was worried about China's aggression and potential to seize more territory from the Philippines. For the United States, the EDCA presented new options for it to prevent China from becoming a regional hegemon in the Indo-Pacific, and for maintaining freedom of navigation in the economically and geopolitically critical South China Sea. So while it did not receive financial assistance under the EDCA in the way it does for its bases in Japan and South Korea, Washington was more than happy to pay the costs if it meant a renewed foothold in Southeast Asia. However, the burgeoning renewal of military ties between the Philippines and the United States would soon meet a snag. The EDCA was negotiated and signed by Filipino President Benigno Aquino III, who served from 2010 to 16, and saw the South China Sea dispute ramp up. His successor, Rodrigo Duterte, was far more skeptical about the United States. In fact, he announced the Philippines' separation from Washington during his first year in office. Many international observers accused Duterte's administration of having authoritarian tendencies, where extrajudicial killings of suspected drug traffickers were permitted. Abroad, Duterte announced early that he would pursue an independent foreign policy. Technically, this policy is mandated in the Filipino constitution, but in practice, it meant that despite the bitter South China Sea dispute, Duterte tried to forge closer relations with Beijing and Moscow in an attempt to reduce the Philippines' dependence on the United States. On a 2016 trip to Beijing, Duterte said, "America has lost. I've aligned myself in your ideological flow." Because of Duterte's foreign policy, the EDCA's full implementation faced numerous delays between 2016 and 2021. For example, on February 11, 2020, Duterte reached the height of his aversion to the United States and announced he would be ending the US-Philippines Visiting Forces Agreement (VFA). The VFA allows American troops to easily deploy to the Philippines to address emergencies or potential contingencies, such as the event of an invasion of Taiwan. The VFA's clauses state that the agreement will remain in place for 180 days after the announcement of a cancellation. Duterte subsequently authorized 2 extensions in June and November of 2020, and the VFA was never cancelled in reality. If it had been cancelled, it would not have voided the MDT, though it would have made implementing it and the EDCA much harder. It amounted to little more than hot air in the end, but the episode showed how far the Philippines had drifted out of America's orbit during most of Duterte's presidency. Then, late in 2021, Duterte abruptly began to change course. Manila endorsed the AUKUS nuclear submarine deal, re-established the Philippines-United States bilateral strategic dialogue, and announced that joint military exercises would be expanded. External pressures had forced his hand. In early 2020, Chinese militia boats encircled the Philippines' Titu Island to prevent the Filipinos from making infrastructure improvements on it. A year later, China authorized its Coast Guard to fire upon foreign vessels if required. Meanwhile, China's promised infrastructure investment in the Philippines, which Duterte hoped would help fulfill his build, build, build infrastructure plan, never materialized. Rodrigo Duterte's term as president ended on June 30, 2022. His successor, Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr., was much more aggressive in distancing the Philippines from China and restoring ties with the United States. The EDCA, after facing so many delays under Duterte, was reinvigorated in November 2022, with $66.5 million worth of project improvements at the first 5 locations. The new construction projects included training facilities, warehouses, and other vital infrastructure. The EDCA accelerated in its scope in April 2023, with 4 new bases being announced. Their locations were concentrated in the northern Philippines, with the clear aim of deterring an invasion of Taiwan. The addition of Taiwan to the EDCA's mission, even if unofficial, indicates a security partnership between the Philippines and the United States that is expanding in its purview. To prove the point, the new bases were followed up with the first quadrilateral defense meeting between the United States, Australia, Japan, and the Philippines in June, which took place between the countries' respective defense chiefs. The Philippines has participated in more joint exercises since Marcos took power, giving its military valuable experience and increasing its readiness for a confrontation in the Indo-Pacific region. It seems likely that the Philippines will soon join South Korea, New Zealand, and Vietnam in the Quad Plus arrangement. For the United States, the presence of the Philippines within its coalition in the Indo-Pacific region cannot be overstated in its importance. The Philippines does not have the economic or military might of the Quad members, but geographically, it's on par with Japan in its importance. The Philippines is part of the first island chain, which forms a natural barrier to containing China's military expansion into the Pacific and Indian Oceans. The Luzon Strait between the Philippines and Taiwan is one of the strategic shipping lanes through which the United States Navy and Air Force can potentially cut off Chinese trade. The new bases in the Philippines make this operation far easier to carry out, adding to the United States' leverage over China and enhancing deterrence against a potential invasion of Taiwan. Meanwhile, in March 2021, the United States announced plans to station new missiles around the First Island chain as part of a military spending package over the following 6 years. Part of the new missile arsenal will likely include the Precision Strike Missile, which is the coming replacement for the ATACMS. This weapon, a short-range ballistic missile, will have an effective range of 500 kilometers, with the ability to deliver cluster munition-compliant payloads. In addition to their precision strike capabilities over such long ranges, these missiles can be launched from mobile systems like HIMARS, making them harder for enemy missiles to detect. There can also be more of them taking to the skies at a given time, because HIMARS launchers can carry 2 precision strike missiles as opposed to 1 ATACMS. The US Army received its first batch of precision strike missiles in December 2023. Their arrival would assist the United States' goal of reinforcing a conventional deterrence in the Indo-Pacific region that many national security experts in Washington believe has been eroded over recent history. While there have been no formal announcements, it's almost certain that some of the announced missiles will include the Precision Strike Missile. It's also likely that some of these missiles will be placed in the EDCA bases in the Philippines. Although the Precision Strike Missile does not have the range to cross the distance from the Philippines to the Chinese mainland, it can hit China's artificial islands if placed in locations like Antonio Batista Air Base. More importantly, the Precision Strike Missile would play a large role in combating an invasion of Taiwan. The distance between Taiwan and the northern Philippines is only about 250 kilometers. A series of hard-to-find HIMARS launchers based in the northern Philippines would disrupt and make a potential invasion more costly. HIMARS launch precision strike missiles near one of the new EDCA sites in particular, Naval Base Camilo Osayas at the very northern edge of the Philippines, could be particularly damaging to any Chinese invasion effort. Although the base would be targeted in a confrontation, as we have seen in Ukraine, HIMARS launchers are easy to hide, which is one of the reasons why the National Defense College of the Philippines called for their presence on Filipino soil. Washington was happy to oblige. HIMARS launchers have already taken part in military exercises on Bosco Island in the northern Philippines. These drills likely simulate how they would be used in a scenario of an attempted Chinese invasion of Taiwan. American and Filipino armed forces have also conducted live-fire drills involving HIMARS and defensive systems like the Patriot missile. These exercises came on the coast of the South China Sea, where their intent was clear. The United States is developing other missiles with longer range. Another weapon the NDCP called for stationing on Filipino soil is the coming long-range hypersonic weapon. This weapon is designed to have a range of 1,725 miles, enough to reach targets in the Chinese mainland from the Filipino bases. To make matters better for Washington and Manila, the LRHW is a land-based, truck-launched weapon, which means it's easier to hide. The LRHW can reach velocities of 3,800 miles per hour. After launch, they move to the top of the atmosphere, staying beyond the reach of enemy missile defense systems, and then when ready to strike, make their descent, too late to be intercepted. The LRHW is designed specifically to defeat enemy anti-access area denial strategies of the type that is at the heart of China's strategy in the Indo-Pacific region. The LRHW uses a booster rocket motor to reach hypersonic velocities. Afterward, the glide vehicle detaches from this booster and can travel at speeds of Mach 5 or higher on its own. The US military's deployment of this weapon has suffered delays. Tests in October 21 and June 22 proved unsatisfactory. In September 2023, the Army admitted that it would not be able to meet its goal of deploying the LRHW by the end of fiscal year 2023. Once deployed, though, the LRHW will add new dimensions to conventional deterrence in the Indo-Pacific region. Their being based in the Philippines will be geographically critical to deterring China's ambitions for the South China Sea and an invasion of Taiwan. Despite Rodrigo Duterte's high personal popularity, polling data in the Philippines shows that most Filipinos did not agree with him on a separation from the United States and for closer ties to China. Public opinion on America remains high within the country, while most Filipinos have little regard for China. In a June 2022 scientific survey of 1,200 adults in the Philippines, respondents suggested that their country should trust the United States, Japan, and Australia the most, while trusting China and Russia the least. 31% of those surveyed said they had a great deal of trust in the United States, while 58% said that the United States should be given at least a fair amount of trust, making for a total trust rating of 89%. 79% trusted Japan, and 78% placed their trust in Australia. Only 38% trusted Russia, and 33% trusted China. On the flip side, 36% of Filipinos said their country should extend not too much trust in China, while 31% said China should not be trusted at all, making for a total distrust rate of 67%. The sample had a 95% confidence interval at an error rate of plus or minus 2.8%. When Ferdinand Marcos Jr. was elected president of the Philippines, it was no coincidence that his first congratulatory call came from Joe Biden. According to family members and other sources close to Marcos, he was personally flattered by the speed and attentiveness of the call. Marcos subsequently took 2 trips to the United States in less than a year, and high-level officials in the Biden administration responded in kind. There has been some controversy, given Marcos's parentage and ties to the late dictator's regime, but security considerations always win out over economic or moral ones in international relations, and Washington has proven keen to regard the past as water under the bridge. There is good reason for the charm offensive. The Philippines is a critically important staging ground in any scenario involving Taiwan and in preserving the integrity of the First Island chain, the primary line of defense against Chinese military expansion into the Pacific and Indian Oceans. The balance of power in the region has indeed eroded, as China's buildup of missiles, ships, planes, and troops has tipped the scale of hard power away from the United States. China's potential with hypersonic weapons has made this eroding deterrent clearer. China can concentrate all of these forces in the region, while the United States is divided into many global commitments. Therefore, America is counting on its alliances with the First Island chain countries to act as a geopolitical force multiplier. The Philippines is critical along that chain of containment. China had an opportunity to bring the Philippines far closer to its orbit and potentially break through the First Island chain during the Duterte presidency. There was even a plan for Chinese companies to take over a shipyard in Subic Bay, the site of the American naval base that had shuttered in 1992. However, senior Filipino government officials worked behind the scenes to kill that deal. They did not trust China, which had not altered its aggressive behaviors in the region. These behaviors, such as bullying Filipino ships out of their internationally recognized territorial waters and not delivering on their Belt and Road-related economic development promises, ultimately meant that Beijing could not take advantage of the Duterte presidency to alter the geostrategic situation in the region. China has long been a country that has failed to live up to its fullest potential. The geopolitical alignment of the Philippines might prove to be just the latest example in that history. Some Filipinos and international observers speculate that Sara Duterte, Rodrigo Duterte's daughter and current vice president of the Philippines, could one day ascend to the higher office and follow her father's policies regarding Beijing. But for now, that's just speculation. The renewal of ties between the Philippines and the United States and the buildup of infrastructure there are critical to the national security interests of both countries. And with such high stakes, relationships tend to have a ghost-in-the-machine dynamic. Rodrigo Duterte's presidency was a good example of this in action. What do you think about the renewal of ties between the United States and the Philippines? How important is the Philippines to America's national security strategy? And how important is the presence of American troops on Filipino soil to that country's well-being in the Indo-Pacific region? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, don't forget to leave a like and hit the subscribe button for more military analysis from military experts.